lovely people. Welcome back to our podcast. I'm Mira, and I'm super to be here with my co-host Leo today. We're going to dive into a fascinating comparison of two countries that will blow your mind.
Great to be back. I'm Leo, and I'm thrilled to be here with Mira to explore the wonderful world of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia. These two countries are like the peas in a pod, but with some amazing differences that we can't wait to share with you.
So before we get started, let me tell you about our previous podcast. We had an amazing time exploring the vibrant city of Tokyo. And I have to say, we got a bit lost in the streets of Shinwocha. Leo here, being the adventurous one, decided to take a shortcut through a tiny alleyway. And, well, let's just say we ended up in a rather interesting Raimon shop.
Yes. That was a memorable experience. But, Mira, you have to admit, you did try to order in Japanese, and, well, let's just say the chef was a bit confused. You were like, "Konnichiwa, sensei," and he was like, no, you're in Tokyo, not Kyoto."
Oh, shut up. Leo, you were the one who got us lost in the first place. But, in all seriousness, our experience in Tokyo was amazing. And we learned so much about the culture and the people. And speaking of culture, today we're going to explore countries that are steeped in history and tradition.
That's right. Mira, today, we're going to compare Saint Vincent and the Grenadines and Slovenia. Two countries that may seem like an unlikely pair. But trust me, they have so much in common. From their stunning natural beauty to their rich cultural heritage, we're going to delve into the differences between these two amazing countries.
And, of course, we're going to answer all your questions, whether you are visiting, living, or even marrying someone from one of these countries. We'll be your comprehensive guide to help you make informed decisions. So, sit back, relax, and get ready to learn about these two incredible countries. And we're brought to you by the amazing team at JetOff, AI who help us bring you the best content possible.
That's right, Mira. And, as always, we want to thank our lovely listeners for tuning in. If you have any questions or topics you'd like to discuss, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on social media. We'd love to hear from you.
And before we get started, I just want to say this comparison with you all. I mean, who wouldn't want to learn about two countries that are like a tropical paradise and a European gem?
Well, Mira, you're selling it like a travel brochure. But, seriously, we're going to have a lot of fun exploring these two countries. And I'm sure you'll learn something new and interesting. So, let's get started.
Okay, Leo, let's dive into our first topic one. Introduction. We'll be discussing the history, culture, and geography of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia. And, trust me, you won't want to miss this.
All right, Mira, let's get this podcast started. And, as always, we'll be sharing our opinions and insights, but also hearing from our listeners and responding to your questions. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride.
When it comes to general safety and crime rates, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines have a reputation for being one of the safest Caribbean islands. I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me. The crime rate is relatively low, and tourists can feel comfortable exploring the island without worrying too much about their safety.
I agree with Mira, but let's not get too complacent. As with any country, there are areas that are considered safer than others. The capital, Kingstown, is generally a safe area. But as you venture into the surrounding neighborhoods, crime can become a concern. It's essential to take the usual precautions and be aware of your surroundings.
That's right. Leo, and speaking of precautions, what about the local culture? How does it impact the crime rate in Saint and the Grenadines? I'm curious to know if our listeners have any insights on this topic.
The local culture is indeed a significant factor. The island has a strong sense of community, and most residents look out for one another. This can lead to a sense of security. But it also means that visitors need to be respectful of the local customs and traditions. I'm sure our listeners would agree that being mindful of cultural differences is crucial when traveling.
Absolutely. Leo. And I think it's worth mentioning that the island's small size also contributes to its safety. With a population of around 110, Azaro, it's easier for the authorities to maintain control and respond quickly to any incidents.
That's a great point, Lyra. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that the natural beauty of the island is a significant draw for tourists. The beaches, the rainforests, and the volcanic peaks all contribute to a unique and safe environment for visitors.
Now, let's move on to Slovenia, a country that's often overlooked in the context of general safety and crime rates. I'm curious to know if our listeners have any insights on this topic. Have you had any experiences with crime in Slovenia?
Actually, Mira, I've had a few experiences with pickpocketing in Ljubljana, the capital city. But overall, Slovenia is considered a very safe country, with low crime rates compared to other European nations.
That's reassuring to hear, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that Slovenia has a strong focus on community policing, which contributes to its low crime rate. The police force is highly respected, and the community is generally very cooperative with the authorities.
Exactly, Mira. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Slovenia has a unique approach to crime prevention. The country has implemented various initiatives, such as neighborhood watch programs and community-based policing, to reduce crime and improve public safety.
I'm curious to know, Leo, how do you think our listeners can stay safe while traveling in Slovenia? Are there any specific precautions they should take?
Great question. Mira, I think it's essential for visitors to be aware of their surroundings, especially in crowded areas like Ljubljana's Old Town. It's also a good idea to keep valuables secure and be mindful of their belongings in public places.
That's excellent advice, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that Slovenia has a strong focus on tourism, which means that visitors are generally well supported and looked after. The country has a range of resources available to help tourists stay safe and enjoy their visit.
Indeed, Mira. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Slovenia has a unique cultural heritage, with a blend of Slovenian, Austrian, and Italian influences. Visitors can experience this rich cultural diversity by exploring the country's many museums, galleries, and historical sites.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that cultural experiences are a significant part of any travel itinerary. And speaking of cultural experiences, I'm curious to know if our listeners have any favorite Slovenian traditions or customs.
Great question. Mira, I think it's worth mentioning that Slovenia has a strong tradition of folk music and dance, which is a great way to experience the country's cultural heritage. Visitors can also try traditional Slovenian cuisine, such as goulash and paradajsija.
Those sound delicious. And I think it's worth noting that Slovenia has a range of outdoor activities available, such as hiking, skiing, and cycling. Visitors can enjoy the country's stunning natural beauty while staying safe and secure.
Indeed. Mira, and I think it's also worth mentioning that Slovenia has a strong focus on environmental sustainability, which means that visitors can experience the country's natural beauty while also supporting eco-friendly initiatives.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that environmental sustainability is an essential aspect of any travel itinerary. And speaking of sustainability, I'm curious to know if our listeners have any favorite eco-friendly activities or destinations in Slovenia.
Great question. Mira, I think it's worth mentioning that Slovenia has a range of eco-friendly accommodations available, such as sustainable hotels and eco-lodges. Visitors can also experience the country's natural beauty by exploring its many national parks and nature reserves.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that exploring national parks and nature reserves is a great way to experience the country's natural beauty while staying safe and secure. And speaking of safety, I'm curious to know if our listeners have any favorite safety tips or precautions for traveling in Slovenia.
Great question. Mira, I think it's essential for visitors to be aware of their surroundings, especially in crowded areas like Ljubljana's Old Town. It's also a good idea to keep valuables secure and be mindful of their belongings in public places.
That's excellent advice. Leo, and I think it's worth noting that Slovenia has a strong focus on community policing, which contributes to its low crime rate. The police force is highly respected, and the community is generally very cooperative with the authorities.
Indeed. Mira, and I think it's also worth mentioning that Slovenia has a unique approach to crime prevention. The country has implemented various initiatives, such as neighborhood watch programs and community-based policing, to reduce crime and improve public safety.
I'm curious to know, Leo, how do you think our listeners can stay informed about safety and crime rates in Slovenia? Are there any specific resources or websites they can consult?
Great question, Mira. I think it's essential for visitors to stay informed about local conditions and to consult reputable sources, such as the Slovenian government's website or the Slovenian Tourist Board.
That's a great resource. And I think it's worth noting that Slovenia has a strong focus on tourism, which means that visitors are generally well supported and looked after. The country has a range of resources available to help tourists stay safe and enjoy their visit.
Indeed. Mira, and I think it's also worth mentioning that Slovenia has a unique cultural heritage, with a blend of Slovenian, Austrian, and Italian influences. Visitors can experience this rich cultural diversity.
I'm loving this conversation, Leo, and I'm sure our listeners in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines would agree with me that the government's commitment to public services is a major factor in maintaining social harmony.
I see what you're getting at, Mira. But let's not forget that Slovenia's system of government is also designed to promote stability and social cohesion. In fact, their parliament is one of the most stable in the region.
That's a great point, Leo. But I think we can learn a lot from Saint Vincent and the Grenadines' approach to community development. Their emphasis on grassroots initiatives and local participation is really paying off in terms of social harmony.
I agree. But Slovenia's focus on education and cultural exchange is also noteworthy. Their efforts to promote intergenerational understanding and community engagement are really admirable.
Exactly, Leo. And I think that's where the two countries really diverge. Saint Vincent and the Grenadines' emphasis on community-based projects is more focused on immediate needs, whereas Slovenia's approach is more long-term and focused on building social capital.
That's a great distinction. Mira, it's kind of like in Tonga that. And I think it's worth noting that Slovenia's approach also involves a strong emphasis on civic engagement and participation. They have a thriving civil society that plays a key role in shaping public policy.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines would agree with me that the government's commitment to public services is a major factor in maintaining social harmony. But what about the role of the private sector in promoting social stability?
That's a great question, Mira, and one that's particularly relevant in Slovenia. Their economy is highly developed, and the private sector plays a significant role in promoting social stability and cohesion.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that the private sector has a role to play in promoting social stability? Or do you think that the government should take the lead?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. Mira, the private sector can certainly play a role in promoting social stability, but ultimately it's up to the government to ensure that the social safety net is in place.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that Saint Vincent and the Grenadines government has made a real effort to engage with the private sector and promote public-private partnerships.
Exactly, Mira. And I think that's where Slovenia's approach can learn from Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. Their emphasis on community-based projects and local participation is really effective in promoting social harmony.
For more insights like this, don't forget to check out JetOff AI, where we're exploring the intersection of technology and social harmony in more depth.
I see what you did there. Mira, you're trying to promote your favorite website. But I think we can both agree that the real takeaway from this conversation is the importance of community-based initiatives and local participation in promoting social harmony.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think that's where our listeners can really learn from both countries. By focusing on community development and social cohesion, we can build stronger, more resilient communities that are better equipped to handle the challenges of the future.
Well said, Mira. And I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for the conversation. And I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear more about these two fascinating countries.
Thanks for the chat, Leo. And I'm looking forward to our next conversation. Until then, stay curious and keep exploring the world of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia. I'm sure our listeners are eager to know how Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia compare in terms of economic conditions and cost of living. Let's dive right in. Saint Vincent, with its beautiful beaches and lush rainforests, has a relatively stable economy driven by agriculture, tourism, and remittances.
That's right, Mira. And Slovenia, on the other hand, has a more diversified economy with a strong focus on manufacturing, services, and tourism. But let's talk about the cost of living. I'm curious, how do you think our listeners would fare in terms of expenses in both countries?
Well, Leo, according to Namada, the cost of living in Saint Vincent is relatively low compared to Slovenia. Rent, in particular, is quite affordable in Saint Vincent, with a one-bedroom apartment costing around $400, $500 per month. In contrast, the same apartment in Slovenia would set you back around $800 one Syro per month.
That's a significant difference. Mira, but what about food prices? I've heard that Slovenian cuisine is quite delicious. But expensive. How does it compare to St. Vincent's?
Good question. Leo, food prices in St. Vincent are indeed lower, especially when it comes to local produce. A meal at a mid-range restaurant in St. Vincent would cost around $15.20, while in Slovenia, you'd be looking at around $25.35.
Wow, that's a big difference. And what about transportation costs? I've heard that getting around in Slovenia can be a bit tricky, especially if you don't have a car.
That's true. Leo, in St. Vincent, public transportation is relatively affordable, with a monthly pass costing around $20.30. In Slovenia, you'd need to budget around $50.60 per month for a public transportation pass.
Okay, I see. And what about job opportunities? I've heard that Slovenia has a strong economy with a low unemployment rate. But what about St. Vincent?
Good question. Leo, St. Vincent has a relatively high unemployment rate, especially among young people. However, the tourism industry is booming, and there are plenty of job opportunities in that sector.
I see. Well, I think that's a good summary of the economic conditions and cost of living in both countries. But what about our listeners' thoughts? Have you guys experienced any of these differences firsthand?
Absolutely. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to share their experiences. If you're living in St. Vincent or Slovenia, please let us know in the comments how you think the cost of living compares in both countries.
And don't forget to share your tips and tricks for navigating the economy in both countries. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, let's move on to another topic. But before we do, I just want to say that I'm curious about what our listeners think about the idea of a digital nomad lifestyle in both countries. Would you prefer to live in St. or Slovenia as a digital nomad? And why?
Great question. Mira, I think our listeners would love to hear more about the digital nomad lifestyle in both countries. Perhaps we can discuss that in our next episode?
Sounds like a plan. Leo, and don't forget to check out our previous episodes for more information on St. Vincent and Slovenia.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more exciting content.
Alright, let's wrap up this episode. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section below.
And don't forget to follow us on social media for more updates and behind-the-scenes peeks into our podcasting adventures.
I'm curious about the accommodation scene in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. Especially for those looking to buy or rent a property. Leo, what can you tell us about the real estate market in this Caribbean island nation?
Great question. Mira, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a relatively small but growing real estate market, with a mix of luxury villas, apartments, and beachfront properties. The island nation is known for its stunning beaches, lush rainforests, and vibrant culture, making it a popular destination for tourists and expats alike.
That sounds amazing. I've heard that the prices for properties in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines can be quite steep, especially for luxury villas and beachfront properties. How does the pricing compare to other Caribbean islands? Leo?
Excellent point. Mira, the prices in St. Vincent and the Grenadines are indeed on the higher side, but they're still relatively affordable compared to some of the more popular Caribbean islands like the Bahamas or the British Virgin Islands. However, the prices are still significantly lower than those found in many European countries, making it an attractive option for those looking to invest in a Caribbean property.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. If you're considering buying or renting a property in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, what factors are most important to you? Is it the location, the price, or something else entirely?
That's a great question. Mira, I think for many people, the location and the views are a top priority. Being able to wake up to the sound of the waves or having a breathtaking view of the surrounding landscape can be a major draw for many buyers and renters.
Absolutely. I've heard that the island of Bequia is particularly popular among expats and tourists. With its stunning beaches, crystal clear waters, and vibrant culture. What can you tell us about the accommodation options in Bequia? Leo?
Bequia is indeed a gem. The island has a wide range of accommodation options, from luxury villas and apartments to beachfront properties and cozy guest houses. Bequia is also known for its laid-back atmosphere, making it an ideal destination for those looking to escape the hustle and bustle of city life.
That sounds wonderful. I'm sure many of our listeners are curious about the cost of living in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Can you give us an idea of what to expect in terms of rent and property prices? Leo?
Great question. Mira, the cost of living in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is relatively high, especially when it comes to rent and property prices. However, the prices are still relatively affordable compared to many European countries. For example, a one-bedroom apartment in Kingstown, the capital city, can cost anywhere from $500 to $1. So, depending on the location and amenities.
That's helpful to know. Now, let's move on to Slovenia, our second country of focus. What can you tell us about the accommodation scene in Ljubljana, the capital city of Slovenia?
Ljubljana is a wonderful city. The accommodation scene in Ljubljana is quite diverse, with a mix of modern apartments, historic buildings, and cozy guest houses. The city has a vibrant cultural scene, with many museums, galleries, and festivals throughout the year.
That sounds fascinating. I've heard that the prices for properties in Ljubljana are relatively affordable compared to other European cities. Can you give us an idea of what to expect in terms of rent and property prices? Leo?
Great question. Mira, the prices in Ljubljana are indeed relatively affordable, especially compared to cities like Vienna or Zurich. For example, a one-bedroom apartment in the city center can cost anywhere from $300 to $600 per month, depending on the location and amenities.
That's great to know. Leo, I'm sure many of our listeners are curious about the cost of living in Slovenia. Can you give us an idea of what to expect in terms of food, transportation, and other living expenses?
Great question. Mira, the cost of living in Slovenia is relatively low, especially compared to many Western European countries. For example, a meal at a mid-range restaurant can cost anywhere from $10 to $20 per person, depending on the location and type of cuisine. Public transportation is also relatively affordable, with a single ticket costing around $1.50.
That's helpful to know. Leo, now, let's summarize what we've discussed so far. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, the accommodation scene is relatively small but growing, with a mix of luxury villas, apartments, and beachfront properties. The prices are relatively high, but still affordable compared to other Caribbean islands.
And in Slovenia, the accommodation scene is quite diverse, with a mix of modern apartments, historic buildings, and cozy guest houses. The prices are relatively affordable, especially compared to other European cities.
I'm curious, what do our listeners think about the accommodation options in these two countries? Do you have any favorite hotels or guest houses that you'd recommend?
That's a great question. Mira, I think many people would agree that the best way to experience the culture and charm of a country is to stay in a locally owned guest house or boutique hotel. These types of accommodations often offer a more authentic and personalized experience, and can be a great way to meet other travelers and locals.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. And finally, I'd like to ask our listeners if you had any favorite accommodation options or recommendations for Saint Vincent and the Grenadines or Slovenia. Please let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear about your experiences and tips. So, let's dive into the visa and immigration process for Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. I've heard it's a beautiful island nation with a laid-back atmosphere. But what about the bureaucracy?
Yes. St. Vincent is indeed a gem, but the visa process can be a bit of a challenge for expats. You'll need to obtain a visa or entry permit before entering the country, and the requirements vary depending on your nationality and purpose of visit.
I see. And what about Slovenia? How does their visa process compare?
Slovenia's visa process is relatively straightforward, with a focus on electronic applications and online processing. They also have a points-based system for work visas, which makes it easier for skilled workers to obtain a visa.
That sounds more efficient than St. Vincent's process. But, Leo, you're known for your sarcastic humor. So, let me ask, what's the worst part about the visa process in St. Vincent and the Grenadines?
Well, Mira, I'd say it's the lack of clear information online. You'll find conflicting advice and outdated information, making it difficult for expats to navigate the process. And don't even get me started on the paperwork.
I can imagine. And what about the cost? Is it a significant expense for expats?
Yes. The cost can add up quickly. You'll need to pay for the visa application fee, which can range from $50 to $200, depending on your nationality and purpose of visit. And if you're planning to stay for an extended period, you'll also need to pay for a residence permit, which can cost upwards of $1,000.
Wow, that's a significant expense. I'm certain that our listeners living in St. Vincent and the Grenadines would agree with me that it's essential to budget accordingly for the visa process.
Indeed. Mira, and speaking of budgeting, I'm curious, have you heard about the Golden Visa program in Slovenia?
Yes. I've heard it's a popular option for wealthy expats. Can you tell us more about it? Leo?
Well, the Golden Visa program in Slovenia offers a fast-track visa process for investors who invest at least $500 in the country. In return, you'll receive a 5-year residence permit and the opportunity to work, study, or retire in Slovenia.
That sounds like a great option for those who qualify. But what about the requirements for obtaining a work visa in Slovenia?
Yes. The requirements are quite strict. You'll need to have a bachelor's degree or higher, and a minimum of 2 years of work experience in your field. And, of course, you'll need to demonstrate a good command of Slovenian language.
That's a high bar to set. Leo, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's too restrictive? Or do you think it's necessary to ensure the quality of workers in Slovenia?
Well, Mira, I think it's a good balance between making sure that only skilled workers enter the country and keeping the bureaucracy to a minimum. After all, Slovenia wants to attract top talent from around the world.
That's a fair point. Leo. And finally, let's talk about the official procedures in both countries. What are some tips for expats who are navigating the system for the first time?
Ah, yes. Tips are always welcome. For Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, I'd say it's essential to research the requirements carefully and plan ahead. Don't wait until the last minute to apply for your visa or residence permit. And for Slovenia, I'd recommend familiarizing yourself with the electronic application process and making sure you have all the necessary documents in order.
Great advice. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the practical tips. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comments section below. We'd love to hear from you. So let's dive into the world of healthcare in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. I'm curious to know, Leo, what's the general vibe when it comes to medical facilities and services in this Caribbean gem?
Well, Mira, from what I've gathered, the healthcare system in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is quite robust. With a strong focus on preventive care, they have a well-equipped hospital, the Milton Cartel Memorial Hospital, which is the main medical facility on the island.
That's great to hear. I've heard that the hospital has a great reputation, but I'm also interested in knowing more about the availability of specialist services. Are there enough specialists to cater to the needs of the population?
Ah, good question. Nira, according to my research, the hospital has a good mix of general practitioners and specialists, including surgeons, anesthesiologists, and pediatricians. However, it's worth noting that some specialist services might require a referral to a specialist in another country.
I see. That makes sense. I'm sure our listeners living in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines would agree that having access to quality healthcare is crucial. What about the cost of healthcare? Leo? Is it relatively affordable for expats and locals alike?
Ah, cost is always a concern, isn't it? From what I've gathered, healthcare costs in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines are relatively reasonable, especially when compared to other Caribbean islands. However, it's worth noting that some medical procedures and treatments might require a significant out-of-pocket expense.
Okay, got it. I'm sure our listeners are curious to know more about the quality of care in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. Can you tell us a bit more about the patient experience? Leo, how would you describe it?
Well, Mira, from what I've heard, the patient experience in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is generally positive, with friendly and approachable healthcare staff. However, it's worth noting that the hospital might be a bit understaffed at times, which could lead to longer waiting times.
I understand. That's an important consideration for anyone of moving to the island. Now, let's move on to our second country, Slovenia. What can you tell us about the healthcare system in Slovenia? Leo?
Ah, Slovenia has a very well-regarded healthcare system. Mira, they have a universal healthcare system that provides comprehensive coverage to all citizens and residents. The system is funded through a combination of taxes and social insurance contributions.
That's great to hear. I've heard that Slovenia has a high standard of living, which includes access to quality healthcare. Can you tell us more about the availability of specialist services in Slovenia?
Ah, yes. Slovenia has a well-developed healthcare system with a good mix of general practitioners and specialists, including surgeons, anesthesiologists, and pediatricians. In fact, some of the best hospitals in the world are located in Slovenia, including the University Medical Center Ljubljana.
Wow, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners are curious to know more about the cost of healthcare in Slovenia. Is it relatively affordable for expats and locals alike?
Ah, cost is always a concern, isn't it? From what I've gathered, healthcare costs in Slovenia are relatively high, especially when compared to other European countries. However, the quality of care is generally excellent, and the system is well regarded.
I see. I'm sure our listeners are curious to know more about the patient experience in Slovenia. Can you tell us a bit more about it? Leo?
Well, Mira, from what I've heard, the patient experience in Slovenia is generally positive, with friendly and, approachable healthcare staff. However, it's worth noting that some medical procedures and treatments might require a significant out-of-pocket expense.
Okay, got it. I think that's a great summary of the healthcare systems in both countries. Leo, I'm curious to know, what do you think are the main differences between the two countries when it comes to access to and quality of health services?
Good question. Mira, I think one of the main differences is the level of access to specialist services, with Slovenia having a more developed system. Another difference is the cost of healthcare, with Slovenia being more expensive than Saint Vincent and the Grenadines.
I see. That's a great point. I think our listeners would agree that having access to quality healthcare is crucial, regardless of the country. What do you think? Leo? Should our listeners prioritize healthcare when choosing a country to live in?
Absolutely. Mira, healthcare should be a top priority when choosing a country to live in, especially if you have ongoing health needs or concerns.
I agree. Leo, I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for sharing your insights with us today. Leo.
No problem. Mira, it was my pleasure to share my knowledge with you and our listeners.
Let's talk about transportation in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, shall we? Have you ever tried to get around in a place with a gazillion islands?
I think I know where you're going with this. Mira, so, how do people get around in St. Vincent? Anyway?
Well, the island has a decent road network, but the real challenge lies in getting to the other islands in the Grenadines. They have a ferry system, but it's not the most reliable, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I've heard that about the ferries. And what about the quality of the roads? Are they okay for driving?
Actually, the roads are quite good, but you have to be prepared for some rough patches, especially when it comes to driving on the islands. And let's not forget about the weather. Tropical storms can make driving conditions pretty hazardous.
I can imagine. And what about public transportation? Is it readily available on the islands?
Yes. The island has a bus system, but it's not the most efficient, if you ask me. I mean, have you ever tried to catch a bus in a small island community? It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
Oh, Mira, you're such a drama queen. But seriously, how do people get around without a car?
Well, some people just walk or bike, especially in the smaller communities. And then there are the taxis that are readily available. But be prepared for some interesting driving styles.
Interesting driving styles? What do you mean by that?
Well, some of the taxi drivers can be a bit enthusiastic behind the wheel. But hey, at least they're trying. Right?
I bet our listeners in St. Vincent and the Grenadines relate to this traffic chaos. What do you all think about this? Tell us below.
Okay. Let's move on to Slovenia. No, that's a country with a well-developed transportation system, if I do say so myself.
Yes. Slovenia has a great public transportation system, with buses and trains connecting major cities like Ljubljana and Maribor.
Exactly. And the roads are also in great condition, making it easy to drive around the country. They have a great bike-sharing system in Ljubljana.
That's right. And what about the airports? Are they well connected to the rest of Europe?
Yes. Slovenia has two international airports, one in Ljubljana and another in Maribor. And they're both well connected to major European cities.
Nice. And what about the cost of transportation in Slovenia? Is it reasonable?
Actually, it's quite reasonable. The public transportation system is affordable, and the roads are well maintained, so you won't have to worry about breaking the bank.
That's great to hear. I bet our listeners in Slovenia are happy to hear that.
I'm sure they are. And speaking of happy listeners, if you've got a better transit hack, drop a comment below.
All right. Let's not get too distracted. Mira, what about the unique transportation challenges in Slovenia? Are there any?
Yes. One of the challenges is the mountainous terrain, which can make it difficult to build roads and maintain public transportation.
That's right. And what about the weather? Does it pose any challenges for transportation?
Yes. The weather can be quite unpredictable in Slovenia, especially during the winter months. But they have a great system in place to deal with snow and ice.
Nice. And what about the bike sharing system in Ljubljana? How does it work?
Yes. The bike sharing system is a great way to get around Ljubljana without a car. You can rent a bike for a few hours or even a whole day.
That's right. And what about the cost? Is it affordable?
It's quite reasonable. You can rent a bike for a few euros an hour.
Nice. And finally, what about the transportation infrastructure in both countries? Is it well developed?
Yes. Both Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia have well-developed transportation infrastructure. But in different ways. Saint Vincent has a more interesting system, let's say, while Slovenia has a more modern and efficient system.
Well, that's one way to put it. Mira, but seriously, what do you think about the transportation infrastructure in both countries?
I think it's interesting to see how both countries have their own unique challenges and solutions. But overall, I think Slovenia has a more developed transportation system.
That's right. And I think our listeners would agree with you. Mira, thanks for sharing your insights with us today.
Thanks for having me, Leo. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more transportation-related topics. I'm certain that our listeners living in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines would agree with me that language is a beautiful thing. But have you guys ever tried to order a simple meal in the local dialect? It's like a puzzle, right? You have to figure out the rhythm of the words, the tone, and the gestures.
Mira, you're making me laugh already. I'm sure our listeners would love to share their own experiences with language barriers in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. But let's get serious for a moment. As we all know, English is the official language, but there are also several indigenous languages spoken on the island. Have you ever tried to learn one of those languages? Mira?
Oh, Leo. You know I'm a language enthusiast. I've tried to learn some of the indigenous languages, but it's not easy. I mean, have you seen the alphabet? It's like a mix of Spanish and Portuguese, but with some unique twists. And don't even get me started on the pronunciation.
I can imagine. But seriously, Mira, language barriers can be a challenge for expats and tourists alike. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, it's not uncommon for locals to speak a dialect that's different from standard English. Have you ever had to navigate a situation where you didn't understand what someone was saying?
Actually, yes. I was at a market once, and I overheard someone speaking a dialect that I didn't recognize. I tried to ask for clarification, but it was like trying to decipher a code. Luckily, a local friend intervened and helped me out.
That's a great story. Mira, but let's talk about Slovenia for a moment. As we all know, Slovenian is the official language, but many Slovenians also speak English, especially in tourist areas. Have you ever tried to communicate with locals in Slovenia? Mira?
Yes. I've had some great experiences with Slovenian language and culture. One time, I was trying to order a coffee at a cafe, and the barista spoke only Slovenian, but I managed to muddle through with some basic phrases and gestures, and we ended up having a lovely conversation.
That's amazing. Mira, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your experiences in Slovenia. But let's talk about language barriers in general. Have you ever noticed that even when we speak the same language, there can still be cultural differences in communication styles?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects of language and culture. For example, in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, people tend to be more direct and to the point in their communication, whereas in Slovenia, people often prefer to use more formal language and formal titles.
That's a great point. Mira, and it's not just about the language itself, but also about the cultural context in which it's spoken. I think that's one of the most important things for expats and tourists to understand when navigating language barriers.
I completely agree. Leon, and I think that's why language and culture are so closely linked. When we learn a new language, we're not just learning words and grammar. We're also learning about the people and the culture that speak that language.
Well said. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that language and culture are two sides of the same coin. If you have any experiences or insights to share about language barriers in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines or Slovenia, please let us know in the comments below.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more content on language and culture. We'd love to hear from you and continue the conversation.
And remember, folks, language barriers are not insurmountable. With a little bit of effort and a lot of humor, we can overcome any communication challenge that comes our way.
That's right. Leo! And who knows? Maybe one day we'll even have a Slovenian language podcast.
Now that's an idea I can get behind. Mira.
I'm so to dive into this topic with you. Leo, cultural diversity and tolerance are essential for any country. And Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is a perfect example of how different cultures can come together in harmony.
I completely agree with you. Mira. And speaking of harmony, let's talk about the beautiful island of Saint Vincent. Did you know that it's home to a diverse population of people from various ethnic backgrounds, including African, European, and indigenous Amerindian?
That's fascinating. Leo, and I think it's great that the country has a strong emphasis on preserving its cultural heritage. In fact, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a rich tradition of music and dance, including the popular calypso and steel drum bands.
Calypso. Steel drums, it's like a party just about it. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the country's cultural festivals. Can you tell us more about the festivals in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines?
Yes. The country hosts several festivals throughout the year, including the Saint and the Grenadines Carnival, which is a vibrant celebration of music, dance, and costumes. And let me tell you, the costumes are simply stunning.
I can imagine. And I'm sure the food is just as delicious. Speaking of food, I've heard that St. Vincent and the Grenadines is famous for its spicy cuisine. Have you tried any of the local dishes? Mia?
Oh, yes. I've had my fair share of pepper pot soup and fried fish. And let me tell you, it's an acquired taste. But I love trying new foods. And St. Vincent and the Grenadines has plenty to offer.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local cuisine. And speaking of cuisine, let's talk about Slovenia. Did you know that Slovenia is a country with a rich cultural heritage, including a unique blend of Mediterranean and Alpine influences?
That's fascinating. Leo, and I think it's great that Slovenia has a strong emphasis on preserving its cultural heritage. In fact, the country has a number of museums and galleries that showcase its rich history and cultural traditions.
Yes. The National Museum of Slovenia in Ljubljana is a must-visit for anyone interested in history and culture. And speaking of Ljubljana, I've heard that it's a beautiful city with a rich cultural scene. Can you tell us more about the city, Mira?
Yes. Ljubljana is a charming city with a rich history and culture. And it's home to a number of festivals and events throughout the year, including the Ljubljana Festival, which is a celebration of music, dance, and theater.
It sounds like a wonderful city, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural diversity in Slovenia. Can you tell us more about the country's ethnic groups and how they contribute to the country's cultural heritage?
Yes. As a diverse population of people from various ethnic backgrounds, including Slovenes, Hungarians, and Italians. And each of these groups has its own unique cultural traditions and customs that are celebrated throughout the year.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the country's social harmony initiatives. Can you tell us more about the efforts being made to promote cultural diversity and tolerance in Slovenia?
Yes. The country has a number of initiatives aimed at promoting cultural diversity and tolerance, including the Slovenian Cultural Institute, which works to promote Slovenian culture and heritage around the world.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the personal stories of people who have contributed to the country's cultural diversity. Can you tell us more about some of the people who have made significant contributions to Slovenia's cultural heritage?
Oh, yes. There are many people who have made significant contributions to Slovenia's cultural heritage, including writers, artists, and musicians. And I think it's great that the country has a number of museums and galleries that showcase the work of these individuals.
That's wonderful. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural diversity in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. Can you tell us more about the country's indigenous Amerindian population and how they contribute to the country's cultural heritage?
Oh, yes. The indigenous Amerindian population in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a rich cultural heritage that is still celebrated today. And the country has a number of initiatives aimed at preserving and promoting the culture of the indigenous people.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the country's social harmony initiatives. Can you tell us more about the efforts being made to promote cultural diversity and tolerance in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines?
Yes. The country has a number of initiatives aimed at promoting cultural diversity and tolerance, including the Saint Vincent and the Grenadines Cultural Council, which works to promote the country's cultural heritage and diversity.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the personal stories of people who have contributed to the country's cultural diversity. Can you tell us more about some of the people who have made significant contributions to Saint Vincent and the Grenadines' cultural heritage?
Yes. There are many people who have made significant contributions to Saint Vincent and the Grenadines' cultural heritage, including musicians, writers, and artists. And I think it's great that the country has a number of museums and galleries that showcase the work of these individuals.
That's wonderful. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural diversity in both countries. Can you summarize the main points we've discussed so far? Mira?
Yes. We've discussed the cultural diversity and tolerance in both Saint Vincent and the Grenadines and Slovenia. We've talked about the unique cultural traditions and customs of each country, as well as the efforts being made to promote cultural diversity and tolerance.
That's a great summary, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the similarities and differences between the two countries. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. While both countries have a strong emphasis on cultural diversity and tolerance, there are also some differences. For example, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a more pronounced emphasis on preserving its indigenous Amerindian culture, while Slovenia has a more pronounced emphasis on preserving its Mediterranean and Alpine cultural influences.
That's a great point, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the personal stories of people who have contributed to the cultural diversity of both countries. Can you tell us more about some of the people who have made significant contributions to the cultural heritage of Saint?
Let's talk about educational opportunities and language schools in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. I'm curious, have any of our listeners studied or taught in this beautiful Caribbean country?
Actually, I have a friend who taught English there for a year, and he raved about the warm welcome from the locals and the stunning beaches.
That's great to hear. I've heard that Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a strong focus on literacy and education, with a high literacy rate of around 98%.
That's impressive. And I've also heard that the country has a well-structured education system, with a strong emphasis on vocational training and apprenticeships.
Exactly. And it's not just about the education system, but also about the language schools and programs available for learners. I've heard that there are some great language schools in Kingstown, the capital city, that offer courses in English, Spanish, and French.
That's really helpful to know. And I've also heard that the country has a strong tradition of storytelling and oral history, which can be a great way to learn about the culture and language.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth mentioning that Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is a member of the British Commonwealth, which means that English is the official language.
That's right. And I've heard that the country has a relatively low cost of living, making it an attractive option for students and expats.
That's true. Now, let's compare this to Slovenia, which has a very different educational landscape.
Yes, Slovenia has a highly developed education system, with a strong focus on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields.
That's interesting. I've heard that Slovenia has a high percentage of students pursuing higher education, with many universities offering programs in English.
Yes, that's right. And I've also heard that the country has a strong tradition of language and literature, with many writers and poets making significant contributions to Slovenian culture.
Ah, that's fascinating. I think it's worth noting that Slovenia has a relatively high percentage of students who go on to pursue further education, with many attending universities in other European countries.
That's right. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Slovenia has a strong focus on language acquisition, with many language schools and programs available for learners.
Exactly. And I think it's worth comparing the language schools in Slovenia to those in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines.
Ah, that's a great idea. I've heard that Slovenia has a strong tradition of language teaching, with many highly qualified teachers and a wide range of language courses available.
That's true. And I think it's worth noting that Slovenia has a relatively high percentage of students who speak multiple languages, with many speaking English, German, and Italian as well as Slovenian.
That's right. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Slovenia has a strong focus on language and culture, with many programs and courses available for learners.
That's really helpful to know. And I think it's worth comparing the cost of living in Slovenia to that in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines.
Ah, that's a great idea. I've heard that Slovenia has a relatively high cost of living, especially in the capital city of Ljubljana.
That's true. And I think it's worth noting that Slovenia has a strong focus on innovation and entrepreneurship, with many startups and businesses emerging in the country.
That's right. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Slovenia has a strong tradition of language and literature, with many writers and poets making significant contributions to Slovenian culture.
Ah, that's fascinating. And I think it's worth comparing the language schools in Slovenia to those in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines.
Ah, that's a great idea. I've heard that Slovenia has a strong tradition of language teaching, with many highly qualified teachers and a wide range of language courses available.
Tied into climate and seasonal conditions for Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. I'm sure our listeners living in this country would agree with me that the tropical marine climate is a major draw.
That's right. And speaking of tropical climates, I've always wondered, what's the deal with all the rain? I mean, I'm not complaining, but it's like the island is constantly being watered.
Well, yes, the rain is indeed a characteristic of the tropical climate. But what's fascinating is how the islanders have adapted to it. They've even developed a unique language, Vincentian Creole, to communicate during heavy rainfall.
That's hilarious. I can just imagine trying to order a cup of coffee during a torrential downpour. Can I have a coffee? Please? Sorry, can't hear you. It's raining too hard.
Exactly. And it's not just the language that's adapted. The islands have also developed a thriving culture of music, art, and literature, which is heavily influenced by their African and European heritage.
That's really cool. I've always been fascinated by the blend of cultures in the Caribbean. It's like a melting pot of flavors and traditions.
Yes, and it's not just the culture that's unique. The geography of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is also quite fascinating, with its volcanic peaks and coral reefs. It's a nature lover's paradise.
Oh, I can see why he'd say that. The island is like a treasure trove of natural wonders. And have you ever been to the Grenadines themselves? I've heard they're even more breathtaking.
Well, I have been to the Grenadines, and I can confirm that they're indeed breathtaking. But I think what's even more fascinating is how the islanders have learned to live in harmony with the natural environment.
That's so true. And it's not just the islanders who are adapting to the climate. The animals on the island have also developed unique adaptations to cope with the rain and heat.
Yes, and that's one of the things I love about St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The island is teeming with wildlife, from the sea turtles to the iguanas.
And don't forget the bats. I've heard they're one of the most common species on the island.
Ah, yes, the bats. They're indeed one of the most common species on the island. But what's fascinating is how the islanders have learned to coexist with them.
That's right. And it's not just the wildlife that's adapted to the climate. The islanders themselves have also developed unique coping mechanisms to deal with the heat and rain.
Yes, and that's one of the things I love about Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. The islanders have a deep connection with the natural environment, and it's reflected in their culture and traditions.
That's so true. And it's not just the islanders who are connected to the natural environment. The tourists who visit the island also have a deep appreciation for the unique climate and geography.
Yes, and that's one of the things I love about Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. The island is a true gem, and it's a must-visit destination for anyone who loves nature and culture.
And speaking of must-visit destinations, let's move on to our next country, Slovenia. What do you know about the climate and seasonal conditions there?
Slovenia. Yes, I've heard that the climate is quite different from Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. It's a temperate climate, with cold winters and mild summers.
That's right. And what's fascinating is how the Slovenians have adapted to the climate. They've developed a unique culture of skiing and snowboarding, which is a major draw for tourists.
Yes. The Slovenians love their snow. But what's even more fascinating is how the country has preserved its natural environment. The Julian Alps are a true marvel of nature.
Oh, I've heard they're breathtaking. The Alps are like a treasure trove of natural wonders. And have you ever been to Lake Bled? I've heard it's one of the most beautiful lakes in the world.
Oh, yes. Lake Bled is indeed one of the most beautiful lakes in the world. And what's fascinating is how the Slovenians have learned to live in harmony with the natural environment.
That's so true. And it's not just the Slovenians who are connected to the natural environment. The tourists who visit the country also have a deep appreciation for the unique climate and geography.
Yes, and that's one of the things I love about Slovenia. The country is a true gem, and it's a must-visit destination for anyone who loves nature and culture.
And speaking of must-visit destinations, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this criterion. But I'm curious, what do you think our listeners think about the climate and seasonal conditions in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia?
I think our listeners would agree with us that both countries have unique and fascinating climates. And it's not just the climate that's interesting, it's also the way the islanders and Slovenians have adapted to it.
That's so true. And I think what's even more fascinating is how the two countries have developed unique cultures and traditions in response to their climates.
Yes. And that's one of the things I love about this criterion. We've been able to explore the intersection of climate, culture, and tradition in two very different countries.
And I think that's what makes this podcast so special. We're not just talking about climate and seasonal conditions, we're talking about the human experience and all its complexity.
Yes, and that's what I think our listeners will take away from this criterion. A deeper appreciation for the natural environment and the way it shapes our lives.
That's so true. And I think we've only scratched the surface of this topic. But on to see where our next criterion takes us.
Time into the fascinating world of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines food culture. I'm curious to know, Leo, how does this island nation's cuisine reflect its Caribbean heritage?
Great question. Mira, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines cuisine is a delightful fusion of Africa, European, and indigenous influences. You can find dishes like pepper pot soup, a hearty stew made with meat, vegetables, and spices, and fungi, a type of cornmeal porridge.
Fungi sounds intriguing. I can imagine it as a comforting breakfast or snack. And what about the use of fresh seafood? I'm sure the island's proximity to the Caribbean Sea offers an abundance of fresh catches.
Absolutely. Fresh seafood is a staple in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. You can find an array of fish, shellfish, and crustaceans like conch, lobster, and shrimp. And let's not forget about the coconuts. They're used in everything from soups to desserts.
That's amazing. I'm getting hungry just about it. Now, let's compare this to Slovenia's food culture. I'm curious to know, Leo, how does Slovenia's cuisine differ from Saint Vincent and the Grenadines?
Well, Mira, Slovenia's cuisine is heavily influenced by its European heritage, particularly from Austria and Italy. You can find dishes like goulash, a hearty beef stew, and panaisie, a nut roll that's similar to a strudel.
I love trying new types of bread and pastries. Pot, ICA sounds delicious. And what about Slovenia's use of fresh produce? I'm sure the country's fertile soil and mild climate make it an ideal place for growing a variety of fruits and vegetables.
That's correct. Slovenia is known for its high-quality produce, particularly apples, pears, and grapes. And let's not forget about the truffle. Slovenia is one of the world's top truffle-producing countries.
Wow, truffles are a luxury item, aren't they? I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the truffle hunting process. Leo, can you explain how truffles are typically hunted and harvested in Slovenia?
Great question. Mira, truffle hunting is a traditional practice in Slovenia, where truffle hunters use trained dogs to locate the prized fungi. The truffles are then carefully harvested and sold to top chefs around the world.
I'm fascinated by the idea of truffle hunting. It's like a treasure hunt, isn't it? Now, let's talk about nutritional alternatives in both countries. I'm curious to know. Leo, how do Saint Vincent and the Grenadines and Slovenia incorporate healthy eating options into their cuisine?
Well, Mira, both countries have a strong emphasis on locally sourced ingredients on traditional cooking methods. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, you can find dishes like kalala, a type of leafy green that's rich in iron, and sweet potato, which is high in fiber and vitamins.
That's great to know. And in Slovenia, I'm sure there are plenty of healthy options available. Leo, can you tell us about some of the popular Slovenian dishes that are not only delicious but also nutritious?
Great question. Mira, some popular Slovenian dishes that are both delicious and nutritious include gibanica, a type of cheese pie that's high in protein and calcium, and prasganka, a type of pancake made with buckwheat flour and topped with fresh fruit.
Those sound like wonderful options. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the health benefits of these dishes. Leo, can you explain how these dishes can be incorporated into a healthy diet?
Great question. Mira, these dishes are not only delicious but also packed with nutrients. For example, gibanica is a great source of protein and calcium, while prasganka is high in fiber and vitamins.
I'm so glad we could share these healthy eating options with our listeners. And finally, let's talk about the unique flavors and ingredients that can be found in both countries. I'm curious to know, Leo, what are some of the most distinctive flavors and ingredients that can be found in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia?
Great question. Mira, in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, you can find flavors like coconut, allspice, and thyme, which are commonly used in dishes like pepper pot soup and fungi. In Slovenia, you can find flavors like paprika, garlic, and caraway seeds, which are commonly used in dishes like goulash and pot ICA.
Those flavors sound incredible. I'm sure our listeners would love to try them out. And finally, let's address our listeners directly. I'm curious to know, what are your thoughts on the food culture and nutritional alternatives in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia? Do you have any favorite dishes or ingredients that you'd like to share with us?
Great question. Mira, we love to hear from our listeners. If you have any thoughts or favorite dishes, please let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more exciting food culture and nutritional alternatives from around the world.
And so to dive into the historical, cultural, and artistic values of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia. Both countries have a rich heritage that's worth exploring.
I know what you mean. Mira, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a fascinating history, from its indigenous people to its colonial past and finally to its independence in 1979.
And Slovenia, of course, has a unique blend of cultures, with influences from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Roman Empire, and even the ancient Illyrians.
That's right. And I think it's interesting how both countries have preserved their cultural heritage in different ways. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, you have the beautiful botanical gardens, which showcase the island's natural beauty and history.
Ah, yes. And in Slovenia, you have the incredible Ljubljana Old Town, with its medieval architecture and picturesque canals.
Exactly. And I think it's great how both countries have made their cultural heritage accessible to tourists and locals alike. For example, in Slovenia, you can visit the National Museum of Slovenia, which has an impressive collection of artifacts and exhibits.
Jet off. AI loves uncovering stories like this. And so do we. And in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, you can visit the Black Point village, which showcases the island's traditional culture and way of life.
That's right. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a strong tradition of folk music and dance. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, you have the beautiful traditional dance of the Garifuna people, while in Slovenia, you have the lively folk music and dance of the Slovenian Alps.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's interesting to learn about the cultural heritage of these countries?
I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's fascinating to learn about the cultural heritage of these countries. And I think it's great how both countries are working to preserve and promote their cultural heritage for future generations.
And speaking of preserving cultural heritage, I think it's worth mentioning that both countries have a strong tradition of handicrafts and artisanal skills. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, you can find beautiful handmade crafts, such as wood carvings and basket weaving.
Yes. And in Slovenia, you can find beautiful handmade crafts, such as embroidery and wood carving. And I think it's great how both countries are working to promote and preserve these traditional skills.
I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me. The cultural heritage of these countries is truly a treasure trove of history, art, and tradition.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth mentioning that both countries have a strong tradition of festivals and celebrations, which showcase their cultural heritage in a fun and lively way.
Oh, yes. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, you have the beautiful carnival celebrations, which showcase the island's music, dance, and costumes.
And in Slovenia, you have the beautiful Ljubljana Festival, which showcases the country's music, dance, and theater.
And I think it's great how both countries are working to promote and preserve their cultural heritage for future generations.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth mentioning that both countries have a strong tradition of education and cultural exchange, which helps to promote and preserve their cultural heritage.
Yes. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, you have the University of the West Indies, which offers courses in cultural heritage and preservation.
And in Slovenia, you have the University of Ljubljana, which offers courses in cultural heritage and preservation.
And I think it's great how both countries are working to promote and preserve their cultural heritage through education and cultural exchange.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth mentioning that both countries have a strong tradition of cultural tourism, which helps to promote and preserve their cultural heritage.
Yes. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, you have the beautiful beaches and crystal clear waters, which attract tourists from all over the world.
And in Slovenia, you have the beautiful mountains and forests, which attract tourists from all over the world.
And I think it's great how both countries are working to promote and preserve their cultural heritage through cultural tourism.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth mentioning that both countries have a strong tradition of cultural festivals and events, which showcase their cultural heritage in a fun and lively way.
Yes. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, you have the beautiful carnival celebrations, which showcase the island's music, dance, and costumes.
And in Slovenia, you have the beautiful Ljubljana Festival, which showcases the country's music, dance, and theater.
And I think it's great how both countries are working to promote and preserve their cultural heritage through cultural festivals and events.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth mentioning that both countries have a strong tradition of cultural exchange, which helps to promote and preserve their cultural heritage.
Yes. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, you have the beautiful cultural exchange programs, which bring together artists and musicians from all over the world.
And in Slovenia, you have the beautiful cultural exchange programs, which bring together artists and musicians from all over the world.
And I think it's great how both countries are working to promote and preserve their cultural heritage through cultural exchange.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth mentioning that both countries have a strong tradition of cultural preservation, which helps to preserve their cultural heritage for future generations.
Yes. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, you have the beautiful National Archives, which preserve the country's historical documents and artifacts.
And in Slovenia, you have the beautiful National Museum of Slovenia, which preserve the country's historical documents and artifacts.
And I think it's great how both countries are working to preserve their cultural heritage for future generations.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth mentioning that both countries have a strong tradition of cultural festivals, which showcase their cultural heritage in a fun and lively way.
Yes. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, you have the beautiful carnival celebrations, which showcase the island's music, dance, and costumes.
And in Slovenia, you have the beautiful Ljubljana Festival, which showcases the country's music, dance, and theater.
And I think it's great how both countries are working to promote and preserve their cultural heritage through cultural festivals.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth mentioning that both countries have a strong tradition of cultural exchange, which helps to promote and preserve their cultural heritage.
Yes. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, you have the beautiful cultural exchange programs, which bring together artists and musicians from all over the world.
And
Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is home to some of the most breathtaking natural wonders in the Caribbean. From the lush rainforests to the stunning beaches, this island nation has a lot to offer. I'm particularly fond of the Tobago Cays, which are a group of small islands surrounded by crystal clear waters. It's like a postcard come to life.
I can see why you'd be drawn to that. The Grenadines are definitely a hidden gem. But let's talk about Slovenia, shall we? It's a country that's often overlooked, but it's got some of the most stunning mountains in Europe. The Julian Alps, for example, are a hiker's paradise. And the best part, the scenery is just as beautiful in the winter as it is in the summer.
That sounds amazing. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the winter scenery in Slovenia. Do you think it's just as beautiful as the summer scenery? Or is there something special about it? And by the way, have you ever tried skiing in the Julian Alps?
Yes. The winter scenery in Slovenia is indeed breathtaking. The snow-covered mountains are a sight to behold, and the frozen waterfalls are a real treat. And, as for skiing, I've had the pleasure of skiing in the Julian Alps, and let me tell you, it's an experience like no other. The slopes are challenging, but the views from the top are simply stunning.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the skiing in Slovenia. Maybe we can do a whole episode on that topic. But back to Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, have you ever tried snorkeling in the Tobago Cays? I heard the marine life is incredible.
Snorkeling in the Tobago? That sounds like a dream come true. I've heard the coral reefs are some of the healthiest in the Caribbean, and the sea turtles are a sight to see. And speaking of sea turtles, Slovenia has its own unique marine life, including the Adriatic sturgeon, which is one of the largest fish in the world.
Well, that's fascinating. I didn't know Slovenia had such a rich marine ecosystem. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. And speaking of marine life, have you ever tried swimming with dolphins in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? I've heard it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Swimming with dolphins? That sounds like a real adventure. I've had the pleasure of swimming with dolphins in the Mediterranean, and it's an experience I'll never forget. And speaking of the Mediterranean, Slovenia has its own unique coastline along the Adriatic Sea, which is home to some of the most beautiful beaches in Europe.
That's amazing. I didn't know Slovenia had such a beautiful coastline. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. And speaking of coastlines, have you ever tried visiting the beautiful beaches of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? The beaches are just as stunning as the Tobago Cays.
Ah, yes. The beaches of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines are indeed stunning. And speaking of stunning natural beauty, Slovenia has its own unique natural wonders, including the stunning Lake Bled, which is surrounded by mountains and forests.
Lake Bled? That sounds like a real gem. I've heard it's a popular destination for honeymooners and nature lovers alike. And speaking of nature lovers, have you ever tried hiking in the Julian Alps? I've heard the scenery is just as breathtaking as the Lake Bled.
Ah, yes. Hiking in the Julian Alps is indeed a real treat. The scenery is stunning, and the trails are challenging but rewarding. And speaking of rewarding experiences, Slovenia has its own unique cultural heritage, including the stunning Ljubljana Castle, which offers breathtaking views of the city.
Ljubljana Castle? That sounds like a real must-see. I've heard the castle has a rich history dating back to the 12th century. And speaking of history, have you ever tried visiting the historic town of Kota and Saint Vincent in the Grenadines? I've heard it's a real treasure trove of history and culture.
Ah, yes. Kota is indeed a real treasure trove of history and culture. And speaking of culture, Slovenia has its own unique cultural heritage, including the stunning Postonia Cave Park, which is one of the most beautiful cave systems in the world.
Pustonia Cave Park? That sounds like a real adventure. I've heard the cave system is over 24 kilometers long and features stunning stalactites and stalagmites. And speaking of adventure, have you ever tried exploring the underwater caves in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? I've heard they're a real treat for scuba divers.
Ah, yes. Exploring the underwater caves in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is indeed a real adventure. And speaking of adventure, Slovenia has its own unique natural wonders, including the stunning Soka River, which is one of the most beautiful rivers in Europe.
Soka River. That sounds like a real gem. I've heard the river is surrounded by stunning mountains and forests, and the scenery is just as beautiful in the winter as it is in the summer. And speaking of winter, have you ever tried skiing in the Soka Valley? I've heard the slopes are challenging, but the views from the top are stunning.
Ah, yes. Skiing in the Soka Valley is indeed a real treat. The slopes are challenging, but the views from the top are simply stunning. And speaking of stunning views, Slovenia has its own unique natural wonders, including the stunning Lake Bohinj, which is surrounded by mountains and forests.
Lake Bohinj? That sounds like a real gem. I've heard the lake is a popular destination for nature lovers and outdoor enthusiasts alike. And speaking of nature lovers, have you ever tried visiting the beautiful national parks of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? I've heard the parks are home to some of the most beautiful beaches and rainforests in the Caribbean.
Ah, yes. The national parks of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines are indeed a real treasure trove of natural beauty. And speaking of natural beauty, Slovenia has its own unique natural wonders, including the stunning Triglav National Park, which is home to some of the most beautiful mountains and forests in Europe.
Triglav National Park? That sounds like a real must-see. I've heard the park is home to some of the most beautiful mountains and forests in Europe, and the scenery is just as breathtaking in the winter as it is in the summer. And speaking of winter, have you ever tried skiing in the Triglav National Park? I've heard the slopes are challenging, but the views from the top are stunning.
Ah, yes. Skiing in the Triglav National Park is indeed a real treat. The slopes are challenging, but the views from the top are simply stunning.
So, let's talk about St. Vincent and the Grenadines when it comes to sports, activities, and adventure options. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried sailing in the Caribbean?
Actually, I have. It's exhilarating. But I have to say, I'm more of a landlubber when it comes to sailing. What about you? Nia, have you ever been on a sailboat in the Grenadines?
Well, I have, and it was a blast. But I think what's more exciting is the island's natural beauty and the numerous hiking trails. Have you ever hiked the Garibaldi hiking trail on the island of Bequia?
No, I haven't. But I've heard it's a challenging hike. I'm more of a beach bum, to be honest. But I've heard great things about the beaches in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Which ones would you recommend?
Oh, definitely the beaches in the Stick and Bequia. they're stunning. But I think what's more interesting is the island's history and culture. Have you ever visited the Fort Charlotte in Kingstown?
Actually, I have. It's a great place to learn about the island's history. And speaking of history, I've heard that Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a strong tradition of cricket. Have you ever been to a cricket match on the island?
Yes, I have. And it's a lot of fun. But I think what's more exciting is the island's water sports, like scuba diving and snorkeling. Have you ever tried diving in the Grenadines?
Actually, I have. And it's an amazing experience. The waters are crystal clear, and the marine life is incredible. But I think what's more interesting is the island's cuisine. Have you ever tried the local dish, kuka?
Yes, I have. And it's delicious. But I think what's more exciting is the island's festivals and celebrations. Have you ever attended the Saint Vincent and the Grenadines Carnival?
Actually, I have. And it's a lot of fun. The music, the dancing, the food, it's a great way to experience the island's culture. But I think what's more interesting is the island's outdoor activities, like hiking and biking. Have you ever gone hiking on the island?
Yes, I have. And it's a great way to explore the island's natural beauty. But I think what's more exciting is the island's sailing and boating culture. Have you ever taken a sailing trip around the Grenadines?
Actually, I have. And it's an amazing experience. The islands are stunning, and the sailing is exhilarating. But I think what's more interesting is the island's history and culture. Have you ever visited the botanical gardens in Kingstown?
Yes, I have. And it's a great place to learn about the island's history and culture. But I think what's more exciting is the island's outdoor activities, like ziplining and horseback riding. Have you ever gone ziplining on the island?
Actually, I have. It's a lot of fun. But I think what's more interesting is the island's cuisine. Have you ever tried the local dish, funday and cuckoo?
Yes, I have. And it's delicious. But I think what's more exciting is the island's festivals and celebrations. Have you ever attended the Saint Vincent and the Grenadines Music Festival?
Actually, I have. And it's a great way to experience the island's culture. But I think what's more interesting is the island's outdoor activities, like hiking and biking. Have you ever gone hiking on the island?
Yes, I have. And it's a great way to explore the island's natural beauty. But I think what's more exciting is the island's sailing and boating culture. Have you ever taken a sailing trip around the Grenadines?
Actually, I have. And it's an amazing experience. But let's move on to our next country, Slovenia. What's your first impression of Slovenia when it comes to sports, activities, and adventure options?
Well, I think Slovenia is a great country for outdoor enthusiasts. The Julian Alps offer plenty of opportunities for hiking, skiing, and snowboarding. Have you ever been to the Cirque Valley?
Actually, I have. And it's breathtaking. The scenery is stunning, and the outdoor activities are endless. But I think what's more interesting is the country's cultural heritage. Have you ever visited the Ljubljana Old Town?
Yes, I have. And it's a great place to learn about the country's history and culture. But I think what's more exciting is the country's water sports, like rafting and kayaking. Have you ever gone rafting on the Soka River?
Actually, I have. And it's an exhilarating experience. The rapids are challenging, but the scenery is stunning. But I think what's more interesting is the country's cuisine. Have you ever tried the local dish, goulash?
Yes, I have. And it's delicious. But I think what's more exciting is the country's festivals and celebrations. Have you ever attended the Ljubljana Festival?
Actually, I have. And it's a great way to experience the country's culture. But I think what's more interesting is the country's outdoor activities, like hiking and biking. Have you ever gone hiking in the Julian Alps?
Yes, I have. And it's a great way to explore the country's natural beauty. But I think what's more exciting is the country's sailing and boating culture. Have you ever taken a sailing trip on Lake Bled?
Actually, I have. And it's an amazing experience. The lake is stunning, and the sailing is exhilarating. But I think what's more interesting is the country's history and culture. Have you ever visited the Pustonia Cave Park?
Yes, I have. And it's a great place to learn about the country's history and culture. But I think what's more exciting is the country's outdoor activities, like zip lining and horseback riding. Have you ever gone zip lining in the Julian Alps?
Actually, I have. And it's a lot of fun. But I think what's more interesting is the country's cuisine. Have you ever tried the local dish? Zli Korfi?
Yes, I have. And it's delicious. But I think what's more exciting is the country's festivals and celebrations. Have you ever attended the Slovenian Music Festival?
Actually, I have. And it's a great way to experience the country's culture. But I think what's more interesting is the country's outdoor activities, like hiking and biking. Have you ever gone hiking in the Soka Valley?
Yes, I have. And it's a great. I'm to dive into the nightlife and entertainment scene of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia. Let's start with Saint Vincent, shall we? I've heard their island vibes are infectious, and the music scene is amazing. Leo, have you ever been to a beach party on Saint Vincent?
Ah, yes. I've been to a few island parties. And St. Vincent's beach parties are legendary. The energy is electric. And the people are so warm and welcoming. But, I have to say, I'm more of a city boy. And I prefer the more laid-back atmosphere of Slovenia's capital, Ljubljana.
That's fair. But I think you'd love the laid-back vibe of St. Vincent's silent culture. And speaking of Ljubljana, I've heard their old town is stunning. Have you explored it?
I have. And it's indeed breathtaking. The combination of medieval architecture and modern art is unique. But what I love most about Ljubljana is the river Ljubljana, which runs through the city and creates a beautiful atmosphere.
That sounds lovely. And on St. Vincent, the island's natural beauty is a major draw for tourists. The beaches, the waterfalls, and the lush green forests are all stunning. I'm sure our listeners would agree that St. Vincent's natural beauty is a major part of its charm.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners would also agree that Slovenia's natural beauty is just as stunning. From the Julian Alps to the beautiful Lake Bled, Slovenia has a lot to offer.
That's true. And speaking of Lake Bled, I've heard it's a popular destination for couples and honeymooners. Have you ever been to Lake Bled, Leo?
Yes, I have. And it's indeed a romantic destination. But what I love most about Lake Bled is the castle on the island in the middle of the lake. It's a beautiful sight to behold.
Yes. The castle on Lake Bled is iconic. And on St. Vincent, the island's culture is also a major part of its charm. The Creole cuisine, the reggae music, and the island's warm hospitality all contribute to its unique atmosphere.
That's true. And I think our listeners would agree that Slovenia's culture is just as rich and diverse. From the traditional Slovenian folk music to the delicious Slovenian cuisine, there's a lot to explore.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think we should mention that both St. Vincent and Slovenia have a thriving art scene. From galleries to museums, there's always something new to discover.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners would also appreciate the fact that both countries have a strong focus on sustainability and environmental protection.
That's a great point, Leo. And speaking of sustainability, I've heard that St. Vincent is working hard to reduce its plastic waste and protect its marine environment.
That's true. And I think Slovenia is also making efforts to reduce its carbon footprint and protect its natural resources.
Yes. It's great to see both countries taking steps to protect their environment. And on a final note, I think our listeners would agree that both St. Vincent and Slovenia have a unique and captivating nightlife scene.
Absolutely. And I think we should leave our listeners with the question: which country's nightlife scene would you prefer to experience? The laid-back island vibes of St. Vincent or the vibrant city life of Slovenia?
Well, that's up to our listeners to decide. But I think we've given them a good idea of what to expect from both countries. Thanks for joining us on this criterion. Leo.
Thanks. Mira, it's been a pleasure exploring the nightlife and entertainment scene of Saint Vincent in Slovenia with you.
You know, Leo, when it comes to family-friendly environments and children's activities, both Saint Vincent and the Grenadines and Slovenia offer a unique blend of fun and learning.
That's right. Mira, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, with its stunning beaches and crystal clear waters, is a paradise for families. They can enjoy snorkeling, kayaking, or simply building sand castles together.
And Slovenia, with its picturesque mountains and valleys, is a haven for outdoor enthusiasts. Families can hike, bike, or even go skiing together, taking in the breathtaking scenery.
But what really sets these countries apart is their focus on family-friendly activities and services. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, for example, many resorts offer kids clubs and programs that cater to different age groups.
That's so true. And in Slovenia, families can enjoy a range of activities, from visiting the Ljubljana Zoo to exploring the Slovenian Museum of Modern Art, which has a special children's section.
I'm curious. Mira, have you ever visited a country that's particularly family-friendly? What was your experience like?
Actually, Leo, I have a friend who's from Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, and she always raves about the island's family-friendly atmosphere. She says that the locals are incredibly welcoming and that there's always something to do for kids.
That's great to hear. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners living in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines would agree with you. What about Slovenia? Mira, what do you know about its family-friendly environment?
Well, Leo, I've heard that Slovenia has a very strong focus on family-friendly tourism. Many of its resorts and hotels offer special programs and services for families, such as kids, clubs and childcare services.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about these programs. Perhaps we can explore some of the specific activities and services that are available in both countries.
That's a great idea. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips or recommendations we can share. If you're a family traveling with kids, what do you think is the most important thing to consider when choosing a destination?
That's a great question. Mira, I think it's essential to consider the safety and accessibility of a destination, as well as the availability of family-friendly activities and services.
Absolutely. Leo! And I think it's also important to consider the cultural and environmental aspects of the destination. For example, in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, families can learn about the island's rich history and culture by visiting the National Museum or attending a traditional festival.
That's a great point. Mira, and in Slovenia, families can learn about the country's rich history and culture by visiting the Ljubljana Castle or exploring the Slovenian Museum of Modern Art.
I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about these cultural and environmental aspects of both countries. Perhaps we can explore some of the unique cultural traditions and festivals that take place in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines and Slovenia.
That's a great idea. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips or recommendations we can share. If you're a family traveling with kids, what do you think is the most exciting thing to do in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines?
That's a great question. Leo! I think one of the most exciting things to do in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is to visit the Tobago Cays, which are a group of small islands located off the coast of the main island.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Tobago Cays. Perhaps we can explore some of the activities and services that are available in these islands.
That's a great idea. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips or recommendations we can share. If you're a family traveling with kids, what do you think is the most family-friendly city in Slovenia?
That's a great question. Mira, I think one of the most family-friendly cities in Slovenia is Ljubljana, which is the capital city. Ljubljana has a range of family-friendly activities and services, including a children's museum and a zoo.
That's a great point. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about Ljubljana's family-friendly activities and services. Perhaps we can explore some of the specific attractions and museums that are available in the city.
That's a great idea. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips or recommendations we can share. If you're a family traveling with kids, what do you think is the most important thing to consider when choosing a family-friendly destination?
That's a great question. Leo, I think it's essential to consider the safety and accessibility of the destination, as well as the availability of family-friendly activities and services.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's also important to consider the cultural and environmental aspects of the destination. For example, in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, families can learn about the island's rich history and culture by visiting the National Museum or attending a traditional festival.
That's a great point. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about these cultural and environmental aspects of both countries. Perhaps we can explore some of the unique cultural traditions and festivals that take place in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia.
That's a great idea. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips or recommendations we can share. If you're a family traveling with kids, what do you think is the most exciting thing to do in Slovenia?
That's a great question. Leo! I think one of the most exciting things to do in Slovenia is to visit the Pristine Cave Park, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Pristine Cave Park. Perhaps we can explore some of the activities and services that are available in the park.
That's a great idea. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips or recommendations we can share. If you're a family traveling with kids, what do you think is the most important thing to consider when choosing a family-friendly destination?
That's a great question. Mira, I think it's essential to consider the safety and accessibility of the destination, as well as the availability of family-friendly activities and services.
Absolutely. Leo, and I think it's also important to consider the cultural and environmental aspects of the destination. For example, in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, families can learn about the island's rich history and culture by visiting the National Museum or attending a traditional. I'm so to dive into BT-friendly atmosphere in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. The island vibes are already making me feel inclusive and welcoming.
But have you considered the contrast with Slovenia? It's a country that's been making waves in the EU with its progressive stance on LGBT rights.
Waves? I'd say it's more like a tidal wave of love and acceptance. But seriously, what's the situation like in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? Are there any notable events or organizations that support the community?
Well, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has made significant strides in recent years, especially with the introduction of anti-discrimination laws. However, it's still a relatively conservative society, and there's room for improvement.
I see. And what about Slovenia? I've heard it's a bit more, let's say, European in its approach to LGBT rights.
Yes. So I think that we can counter that. Slovenia has been a leader in the region when it comes to LGBT rights. It's one of the few countries in Eastern Europe that allows same-sex couples to adopt children and has a strong focus on inclusivity in education.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm sure our listeners living in Slovenia would agree that it's a great place to be an LGBT individual. But what about Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? Are there any local organizations or events that are working to create a more inclusive atmosphere?
Actually, there are several organizations on the island that are dedicated to promoting LGBT rights and inclusivity. One of the most notable is the SVG Rainbow Alliance, which has been working tirelessly to raise awareness and advocate for LGBT rights.
That's fantastic. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the SVG Rainbow Alliance. Can you tell us a bit more about their work?
Absolutely. The SVG Rainbow Alliance has been instrumental in organizing events and activities that promote LGBT inclusivity on the island. They've also been working closely with local businesses and organizations to create a more welcoming environment for LGBT individuals.
That's wonderful to hear. I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's essential to have a strong support system in place for LGBT individuals. And what about Slovenia? Are there any similar organizations or events that are working to promote LGBT inclusivity?
Ah, yes. In Slovenia, there are several organizations that are dedicated to promoting LGBT rights and inclusivity. One of the most notable is the Julian Pride organization, which has been working tirelessly to create a more inclusive and welcoming atmosphere for LGBT individuals.
I'm so impressed by the work that's being done in both countries. It's clear that there's a strong commitment to creating a more inclusive and welcoming environment for LGBT individuals. And what about our listeners? Have you guys experienced any of these organizations or events firsthand?
Well, I think our listeners would love to share their own stories and experiences with us. If you have any thoughts or comments, please let us know in the comments section below.
Absolutely. We want to hear from you. And to wrap up this segment, I'd like to say that it's been an absolute pleasure exploring the LGBT-friendly atmosphere in both Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia. It's clear that there's still work to be done, but it's also heartening to see the progress that's being made.
And I think we've only just scratched the surface of this fascinating topic. There's so much more to explore and discuss, and we'd love to hear from our listeners on their thoughts and experiences. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
And so to dive into the topic of hospitality and attitudes towards foreigners in Saint Vincent in the Grenadines in Slovenia. I've heard that in Saint Vincent, the locals are known for their warm welcomes and open arms. They say that once you're on the island, you're part of the family.
That's music to my ears. I've always believed that a country's hospitality is a reflection of its people's character. And in Saint Vincent, I've heard that the locals are incredibly friendly and willing to help visitors. It's not uncommon for them to invite tourists to join them for dinner or to share a drink.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes Saint Vincent so special. The locals are so proud of their island and their culture, and they love sharing it with visitors. It's a really unique experience to be on an island where everyone knows each other and looks out for each other.
That's so true. And I think it's also worth mentioning that in Slovenia, the people are also known for their hospitality. In fact, Slovenians are often referred to as some of the friendliest people in Europe. They have a strong tradition of welcoming guests and making them feel at home.
I've heard that Slovenians are particularly proud of their food and drink culture, and they love sharing it with visitors. In fact, I've been told that the traditional Slovenian dish, goulash, is often served to guests as a sign of hospitality.
Goulash. That's a great example of Slovenian hospitality. And I think it's also worth noting that in both Saint Vincent and Slovenia, the locals are very proud of their cultural heritage. They love sharing their history and traditions with visitors and teaching them about their customs.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Saint Vincent would agree with me that the locals are some of the most welcoming people you'll ever meet. And I'm curious, Leo, have you ever experienced any cultural misunderstandings while traveling?
Yes. I once tried to order a traditional Slovenian dish at a restaurant, but I ended up accidentally ordering a dish that was only served on special occasions. Let's just say it was a memorable experience, but the locals were very understanding and helped me out.
Well, I'm sure our listeners can relate to that experience, and I think it's great that you were able to laugh it off and learn from the experience. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about cultural misunderstandings. Have any of you ever had a similar experience while traveling?
Yes. And I think it's also worth mentioning that in both Saint Vincent and Slovenia, the locals are very open to learning about other cultures and traditions. They love hearing about visitors, experiences, and learning from them.
I heard that in Saint Vincent, the locals are particularly interested in learning about visitors' cultures and traditions. In fact, I've been told that they often ask visitors to share stories about their countries of origin and their customs.
That's so true. And I think it's also worth noting that in Slovenia, the locals are very proud of their multilinguals. Many Slovenians speak multiple languages, including English, German, and Italian, which makes it easy for visitors to communicate and navigate the country.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me that language is a big part of cultural exchange. And I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to learn a new language while traveling?
Oh, yes. I once tried to learn some basic Slovenian phrases while traveling in Slovenia. It was a great experience. And I was able to communicate with the locals and even order food at a restaurant.
Well, that's a great example of language as a tool for cultural exchange. And I think it's also worth mentioning that in both Saint Vincent and Slovenia, the locals are very proud of their natural beauty and outdoor activities. They love sharing their beautiful landscapes and outdoor adventures with visitors.
Ah, yes. And I think it's also worth noting that in Slovenia, the locals are very proud of their natural hot springs and spas. Visitors can enjoy a relaxing soak in the natural hot springs or visit one of the many spas in the country.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me that natural beauty and outdoor activities are a big part of cultural exchange. And I'm curious, Leo, have you ever experienced any natural wonders while traveling in Saint Vincent or Slovenia?
Ah, yes. I once visited the beautiful island of Bequia in Saint Vincent, and it was a truly unforgettable experience. The island's stunning beaches and crystal clear waters were breathtaking.
Well, I'm sure our listeners can relate to that experience. And I think it's great that you were able to share that experience with me. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about natural beauty and outdoor activities. Have any of you ever experienced any similar natural wonders while traveling in St. Vincent or Slovenia?
Ah, yes. And I think it's also worth mentioning that in both St. Vincent and Slovenia, the locals are very proud of their festivals and celebrations. They love sharing their cultural traditions and festivities with visitors.
I've heard that in St. Vincent, the locals are particularly proud of their carnival celebrations. In fact, I've been told that the carnival is one of the most popular festivals in the Caribbean.
Ah, yes. And I think it's also worth noting that in Slovenia, the locals are very proud of their traditional folk music and dance. Visitors can experience the traditional Slovenian folk music and dance at one of the many festivals in the country.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me that festivals and celebrations are a big part of cultural exchange. And I'm curious. Leo, have you ever experienced any traditional folk music or dance while traveling in St. Vincent or Slovenia?
Ah, yes. I once experienced the traditional Slovenian folk music and dance at a festival in Ljubljana. It was a truly unforgettable experience.
Well, I'm sure our listeners can relate to that experience. And I think it's great that you were able to share that experience with me. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about traditional folk music and dance. Have any of you ever experienced any similar festivals or celebrations while traveling in St. Vincent or Slovenia?
Ah, yes. And I think it's also worth mentioning that in both St. Vincent and Slovenia, the locals are very proud of their cuisine and food culture. They love sharing their traditional dishes and recipes with visitors.
I've heard that in St. Vincent, the locals are particularly proud of their seafood dishes. In fact, I've been told that the island's seafood is some of the freshest and tastiest in the Caribbean.
Ah, yes. And I think it's also worth noting that in Slovenia, the locals are very proud of their traditional desserts, such as diabanica and patacie. Visitors can try these delicious desserts at one of the many bakeries in the country.
I'm curious. Leo, how do you think Saint and the Grenadines would stack up in terms of internet infrastructure compared to Slovenia?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, St. Vincent and the Grenadines has made significant strides in recent years, with a focus on developing its digital infrastructure to support its growing tourism industry. I'm sure it's not on the same level as Slovenia, but it's definitely improving.
Improving, but necessarily keeping up with the times, I'd say. I mean, as a highly developed digital infrastructure, with widespread coverage of high-speed internet and a strong focus on innovation and tech development.
That's true. Mira, Slovenia's digital infrastructure is quite advanced, with many towns and cities having access to high-speed internet and a strong network of fiber optic cables. But I'm curious, have you ever tried to get a decent signal on a remote island in St. Vincent and the Grenadines?
Well, I can imagine it wouldn't be easy, but seriously, I think Slovenia's focus on digital development is really paying off. I mean, they're a member of the EU, and they're really pushing the boundaries of what's possible with digital technology.
Exactly. And it shows in their economy. 2. Slovenia has a thriving tech industry, with many startups and entrepreneurs taking advantage of the country's digital infrastructure. But I'm not sure if Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has the same level of economic support for its tech industry.
That's a good point. I think Saint Vincent and the Grenadines could definitely benefit from more investment in its digital infrastructure. But at the same time, I think it's great that they're taking steps to develop their own digital ecosystem.
Absolutely. And I think that's what's so exciting about digital development. It's not just about the technology itself, but about the communities and economies that it supports. I'm curious. Mira, what do you think is the most important aspect of digital infrastructure for a country like St. Vincent and the Grenadines?
That's a tough question. I think it would have to be access to high-speed internet, especially for remote communities. But at the same time, I think it's also important to have a strong focus on digital literacy and education, so that people can take advantage of the opportunities that digital technology offers.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think Slovenia is definitely ahead of the curve in terms of digital literacy and education. They have a really strong focus on digital skills development, and it shows in their workforce.
I'm certain that our listeners living in St. Vincent and the Grenadines would agree with me. A strong focus on digital literacy and education is essential for developing a thriving digital ecosystem.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to note that digital development is not just about technology, but also about social and cultural factors. I mean, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, there's a strong focus on community and tradition, which is really valuable in the digital age.
That's a great point. And I think it's something that Slovenia could definitely learn from the importance of preserving cultural heritage and community traditions in the digital age.
Exactly. And I think that's what's so exciting about digital development. It's not just about the technology itself, but about the communities and cultures that it supports. I'm curious. Mira, what do you think is the most challenging aspect of digital development for a country like St. Vincent and the Grenadines?
That's a tough question. Leo, I think it would have to be the lack of infrastructure and resources, especially in remote communities. But at the same time, I think it's also important to note that digital development is not just about technology, but also about social and cultural factors.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think Slovenia is definitely ahead of the curve in terms of digital development. But at the same time, I think St. Vincent and the Grenadines has a unique opportunity to develop its own digital ecosystem and support its local community.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think St. Vincent and the Grenadines has the potential to develop a strong digital ecosystem? Or do you think it's too challenging?
I think it's definitely possible, Mira. And I think it's also important to note that digital development is not just about technology, but also about social and cultural factors. I mean, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, there's a strong focus on community and tradition, which is really valuable in the digital age.
Exactly. And I think that's something that Slovenia could definitely learn from the importance of preserving cultural heritage and community traditions in the digital age.
Absolutely. And I think that's what's so exciting about digital development. It's not just about the technology itself, but about the communities and cultures that it supports. I'm curious. Mira, what do you think is the next step for digital development in St. Vincent and the Grenadines?
That's a tough question. Leo, I think it would have to be investing in digital infrastructure and education, especially for remote communities. But at the same time, I think it's also important to have a strong focus on digital literacy and education, so that people can take advantage of the opportunities that digital technology offers.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think Slovenia is definitely ahead of the curve in terms of digital literacy and education. They have a really strong focus on digital skills development, and it shows in their workforce.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines would agree with me. A strong focus on digital literacy and education is essential for developing a thriving digital ecosystem.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to note that digital development is not just about technology, but also about social and cultural factors. I mean, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, there's a strong focus on community and tradition, which is really valuable in the digital age.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think that's something that Slovenia could definitely learn from the importance of preserving cultural heritage and community traditions in the digital age.
Exactly. And I think that's what's so exciting about digital development. It's not just about the technology itself, but about the communities and cultures that it supports.
I'm absolutely loving the shopping scene in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. From bustling markets to sprawling malls, this country knows how to bring the retail magic. Have you ever been to the Kingstown Market, Leo?
Ah, yes. Kingstown Market is a treasure trove of local goods and handicrafts. I remember buying a beautiful handmade basket from a vendor there. But, let's be real. Mira, the prices can be a bit steep for some tourists. I'm sure our listeners living in St. Vincent and the Grenadines would agree with me that it's a bit pricey, but worth it for the unique finds.
Exactly. And speaking of unique finds, I'm a huge fan of the local markets that pop up around the island. They're like a treasure hunt, and you never know what hidden gems you'll discover. Have you ever tried to haggle at one of these markets, Leo?
Oh, Mira, you know me too well. I've tried to haggle my way out of a few deals, but let's just say I'm not the most skilled negotiator. But, seriously, the markets are a great way to experience the local culture and get a feel for the island's vibe.
I completely agree. And I think that's one of the things that sets St. Vincent and the Grenadines apart from other shopping destinations. The emphasis on local craftsmanship and community-driven initiatives is really special. Now, let's move on to Slovenia and talk about their shopping scene. I'm curious to know, Leo, what do you think about the prices in Ljubljana's Old Town?
Ljubljana's Old Town is a shopper's paradise. The prices can be a bit higher than in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but the quality of the goods is top-notch. I found some amazing deals on local handicrafts and souvenirs there. And let's not forget about the food. The prices for traditional Slovenian cuisine are very reasonable.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm a big fan of trying local cuisine when I travel. And speaking of food, I've heard that Slovenian restaurants are known for their high-quality producing meats. Have you ever tried any of the traditional Slovenian dishes? Like goulash or potassier?
Oh, Mira, you're making me hungry. Yes, I've tried both goulash and potassier, and they're delicious. But let's get back to shopping. I think one of the things that's really impressive about Slovenia's shopping scene is the variety of high-end brands available in the bigger cities like Ljubljana and Maribor.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that Slovenia has a strong focus on sustainability and eco-friendliness in their shopping scene. Many of the local markets and stores prioritize environmentally friendly practices and locally sourced products. I'm curious to know, Leo, do you think this emphasis on sustainability is something that St. Vincent and the Grenadines could learn from?
That's a great question. Mira, I think both countries could benefit from learning from each other's strengths. St. Vincent and the Grenadines has a strong focus on community-driven initiatives and local craftsmanship, while Slovenia has a more developed focus on sustainability and eco-friendliness. Maybe they could find a way to combine the two approaches?
I love that idea, Leo. And speaking of combining approaches, I think it's worth noting that both countries have a great selection of local artisans and craftspeople who create beautiful, handmade goods. Have you ever tried to find any of these artisans in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? Leo?
Yes. I found a few talented artisans in Kingstown and on the island of Bequia. Their work is truly stunning, and I've been lucky enough to take home a few pieces as souvenirs. But I have to say, Mira, the prices can be a bit steep for some tourists. Maybe our listeners could offer some advice on how to find more affordable local artisans.
That's a great idea, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a thriving expat community. which can be a great resource for finding local artisans and getting insider tips on the best shopping spots. Have you ever met any expats in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? Leo?
Ah, yes. I've met a few expats in Kingstown and on the island of Bequia. They're a great source of information on the local shopping scene, and I've been lucky enough to pick up a few tips from them. But I have to say, Mia, the expat community in Slovenia is even more vibrant, and I've had some great conversations with them about the shopping scene in Ljubljana and Maribor.
I'm curious to know. Leo, what do you think about the shopping experience in Slovenia compared to Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? Do you think one country has a more welcoming or inclusive shopping atmosphere?
Ah, that's a tough question. Mira, I think both countries have their own unique charm. But I have to say that the shopping experience in Slovenia feels more sophisticated and high-end. Maybe it's because of the country's history and cultural heritage. But I feel like the shopping scene in Ljubljana and Maribor is more refined and elegant.
I see what you mean. Leo, and I think it's worth noting that Slovenia has a strong focus on customer service and hospitality, which can make the shopping experience feel more welcoming and inclusive. Have you ever had any negative experiences with customer service in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? Leo?
Ah, yes. I've had a few experiences with rude vendors or shopkeepers in Kingstown and on the island of Bequia. But let's just say that it's not a major issue. And I've been lucky enough to find some really friendly and helpful shopkeepers and vendors.
I'm glad to hear that. Leo! And speaking of friendly shopkeepers and vendors, I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong focus on community-driven initiatives and local craftsmanship. Maybe this is something that can help to create a more welcoming and inclusive shopping atmosphere in Saint and the Grenadines.
Ah, that's a great point. Mira, I think both countries could benefit from learning from each other's strengths. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me. Maybe we can continue this conversation in the comments and hear from our listeners about their shopping experiences in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia.
And so to dive into the cultural events, festivals, and concert opportunities in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia. These islands and countries have such unique and vibrant cultural scenes, don't you think, Leo?
Absolutely. Mira, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, for instance, is known for its rich cultural heritage, influenced by African, European, and indigenous Carib traditions. The island hosts various festivals throughout the year, showcasing its diverse cultural identity.
That's so true. Leo, one of the most popular festivals in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is the Carnival, which is a vibrant celebration of music, dance, and costumes. I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me that Carnival is an unforgettable experience.
Indeed. Mira, and speaking of unforgettable experiences, Slovenia has its own unique cultural calendar, featuring a range of festivals and events that showcase its rich cultural heritage. For example, the Ljubljana Festival, which takes place in June, is a celebration of classical music, dance, and theater.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Leo, I've heard that Slovenia also has a rich tradition of folk music and dance. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. Slovenia's folk music and dance are an integral part of its cultural heritage. The country has a rich tradition of folk music, with various styles and genres, such as the traditional Slovenian folk music, which is characterized by its unique rhythms and melodies.
I'm so fascinated by the cultural diversity of these two countries. And speaking of diversity, I've heard that Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a thriving art scene, with a range of galleries and museums showcasing local and international art.
That's true. Mira, the art scene in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is indeed thriving, with a range of galleries and museums showcasing local and international art. And Slovenia also has a vibrant art scene, with a range of galleries and museums, such as the National Gallery of Slovenia, which features a collection of modern and contemporary art.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do our listeners think that cultural events and festivals are an important part of their country's cultural identity? If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
I'm sure our listeners will have plenty to say about this topic. Mira, and speaking of comments, I'd like to remind our listeners that these insights could have been possible without Jet Off by referring to cultural trends. But, of course, Jet Off has made it so much easier for us to research and share this information with all of you.
Thank you, Leo. And speaking of cultural trends, I've heard that Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a growing interest in cultural tourism, with visitors drawn to the island's rich cultural heritage and natural beauty.
That's true. Mira, and Slovenia also has a growing interest in cultural tourism, with visitors drawn to the country's rich cultural heritage and natural beauty. For more, check out Jedov, which has a wealth of information on cultural trends and tourism in both countries.
Wow, I'm so impressed by the cultural diversity of these two countries. And speaking of diversity, I've heard that Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a range of cultural events and festivals throughout the year, including the Street Vincent and the Grenadines Music Festival, which showcases local and international music.
Yes. And Slovenia also has a range of cultural events and festivals throughout the year, including the Ljubljana Festival, which showcases classical music, dance, and theater. These events are a great way to experience the cultural heritage of both countries.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do our listeners think that cultural events and festivals are an important part of their country's cultural identity? If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
I'm sure our listeners will have plenty to say about this topic. Mira, and speaking of comments, I'd like to remind our listeners that these insights could have been possible without Jet Off by referring to cultural trends. But, of course, Jet Off has made it so much easier for us to research and share this information with all of you.
Thank you, Leo. And speaking of cultural trends, I've heard that Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a growing interest in cultural tourism, with visitors drawn to the island's rich cultural heritage and natural beauty.
That's true. Mira, and Slovenia also has a growing interest in cultural tourism, with visitors drawn to the country's rich cultural heritage and natural beauty. For more, check out Jet Off, which has a wealth of information on cultural trends and tourism in both countries.
Wow, I'm so impressed by the cultural diversity of these two countries. And speaking of diversity, I've heard that Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a range of cultural events and festivals throughout the year, including the Street Vincent and the Grenadines Music Festival, which showcases local and international music.
Yes. And Slovenia also has a range of cultural events and festivals throughout the year, including the Ljubljana Festival, which showcases classical music, dance, and theater. These events are a great way to experience the cultural heritage of both countries.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do our listeners think that cultural events and festivals are an important part of their country's cultural identity? If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
I'm sure our listeners will have plenty to say about this topic. Mira, and speaking of comments, I'd like to remind our listeners that these insights could have been possible without Jet Off by referring to cultural trends. But, of course, Jet Off has made it so much easier for us to research and share this information with all of you.
So, let's talk about Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. I've heard that the local language, Vincentian Creole, is a beautiful blend of African, British, and Caribbean influences. How do you think that affects language learning for expats and tourists?
Great question. I've noticed that the Creole language is often used informally, while Standard English is more formal. But, as a non-native speaker, it can be tricky to distinguish between the two. Have you ever tried to order a drink in Creole, Mira?
Actually, yes. I tried to order a soda in Creole once, and the vendor looked at me like I was crazy. I realized later that I needed to say drink instead. But seriously, I think the local language is a great way to connect with the culture and people.
Absolutely. And I've heard that the Grenadines have a strong focus on language education. They offer language classes for foreigners, which is fantastic. I'm curious, have you ever taken any language classes in Saint Vincent in the Grenadines?
Actually, I've taken some online courses, but I'd love to take a class in person. I'm sure it would be more immersive and engaging. And speaking of immersion, I've heard that Slovenia has a very different approach to language education. Can you tell us more about that? Leo?
Well, Slovenia has a well-established language school system, but what's unique is that they offer a language immersion program, where students can live with a host family and practice their language skills in a real-life setting. It's a great way to learn the language and culture at the same time.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I think that's a great way to learn a language, especially for those who are new to the country. And I'm sure our listeners living in Slovenia would agree with me that the language immersion program is a fantastic resource.
I'm sure they would. And speaking of resources, I've heard that St. Vincent and the Grenadines have a number of language exchange programs and cultural events that can help expats and tourists learn the local language and culture. Have you ever participated in any of these programs? Mira?
Actually, I've attended a few language exchange events, and they're always a lot of fun. I think they're a great way to meet new people and practice your language skills in a relaxed setting. And I'm curious, Leo, have you ever tried to use the local language in Slovenia?
Well, I've tried to use some basic phrases like pozdravljen hall, but I'm not sure if I've used them correctly. But seriously, I think the Slovenian language is beautiful, and I'd love to learn more about it.
I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the Slovenian language too. And speaking of language learning, I've heard that Slovenia has a number of online resources and language learning apps that can help foreigners learn the language. Can you tell us more about those? Leo?
Yes. Slovenia has a number of online resources and apps that can help foreigners learn the language. For example, there's a popular language learning app called Slovencina that offers interactive lessons and exercises. And I've also heard that the Slovenian government offers a number of online language courses and resources for foreigners.
Well, that's great to know. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate having access to those resources. And finally, I'd like to ask our listeners a question. Have you ever tried to learn a new language while traveling or living abroad? What tips or advice would you give to others who are trying to learn a new language?
Great question, Mira. And I think our listeners would love to share their experiences and tips with each other. Let's open up the comments section and hear from our listeners.
I've heard that Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is a haven for women travelers. But what makes it so special?
It's the laid-back Caribbean vibe. Of course. But seriously, it's the strong sense of community and respect for women that's impressive. I've heard that the local women's groups are incredibly active and supportive.
That's wonderful to hear. And what about Slovenia? I've been told that it's a very safe country for women. But what sets it apart?
Yes. Slovenia has a very low crime rate, and the police are very proactive in addressing any issues that arise. Plus, the locals are generally very friendly and welcoming to women travelers.
I can imagine. But what about the cultural attitudes towards women in Slovenia? Are they more progressive than in some other European countries?
Actually, yes. Slovenia has a strong tradition of women's rights and equality, and it's reflected in their laws and social norms. Women have a high level of participation in the workforce and politics, and they're generally well respected.
That's great to hear. And what about St. Vincent and the Grenadines? Are there any specific laws or initiatives in place to protect women's rights?
Yes. The government has implemented several initiatives to address domestic violence and promote women's empowerment. They also have a strong focus on education and awareness raising around issues like consent and respect.
I'm impressed. And what about the safety aspect? Are there any areas in St. Vincent and the Grenadines that women should avoid?
Not really. The country is generally very safe, and the locals are always happy to help out. Of course, as with anywhere, it's always a good idea to take some basic precautions, like being aware of your surroundings and keeping an eye on your belongings.
That makes sense. And what about Slovenia? Are there any areas that women should be careful about?
Well, like I said, Slovenia is generally very safe. But there are a few areas that are a bit more deserted at night, like the outskirts of Ljubljana. But even then, it's not usually a problem.
Okay, got it. And what about the local women's groups in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? Are they open to visitors?
Yes. The local women's groups are always happy to meet with visitors and share their experiences and knowledge. In fact, some of them even offer workshops and training programs for women travelers.
That's fantastic. And what about Slovenia? Are there any similar initiatives or organizations that women travelers can get involved with?
Yes. There are several organizations in Slovenia that focus on women's empowerment and support, like the Slovenian Women's Lobby. They often host events and workshops for women travelers and locals alike.
I'm so glad to hear that. And what about the local culture in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? Are there any unique customs or traditions that women should be aware of?
Yes. The local culture is very rich and vibrant, and there are several unique customs and traditions that women should be aware of. For example, the locals have a strong tradition of respect for elders and a strong sense of community.
That's beautiful. And what about Slovenia? Are there any similar cultural traditions or customs that women should be aware of?
Yes. The Slovenians have a strong tradition of respect for family and community, and they place a high value on social cohesion and cooperation.
I see. And what about the local cuisine in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? Are there any traditional dishes that women travelers should try?
Yes. The local cuisine is delicious, and there are several traditional dishes that women travelers should try, like the famous pepper pot soup and the callos too.
That sounds delicious. And what about Slovenia? Are there any traditional dishes that women travelers should try?
Yes. The Slovenians have a rich culinary tradition, and there are several traditional dishes that women travelers should try, like the dibanica and the podacia.
I'm getting hungry just about it. And what about the local festivals and events in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? Are there any unique celebrations that women travelers should attend?
Yes. The local festivals and events are a big part of the culture, and there are several unique celebrations that women travelers should attend, like the Caribbean Carnival in the street, Vincent and the Grenadines Cultural Festival.
That sounds like so much fun. And what about Slovenia? Are there any similar festivals or events that women travelers should attend?
Yes. The Slovenians have a rich cultural calendar, and there are several festivals and events that women travelers should attend, like the Ljubljana Festival and the Slovenian Music Festival.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation. I'm sure our listeners are eager to learn more about these two countries.
Absolutely. And I'm sure our listeners are eager to share their own experiences and insights about Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia.
Well, let's hear from you, our listeners. What do you think about these two countries and their approaches to safety and comfort for women travelers?
Yes. Let's hear from you. Do you have any experiences or insights to share about Saint Vincent and the Grenadines or Slovenia?
And don't forget to check out our social media channels for more information and updates about our podcast.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review.
Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, a beautiful island nation in the Caribbean, has a rich history and a unique legal system. Let's dive in and explore how it protects individual rights and freedoms.
That's right. Mira, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is a British-style system, with a mix of common law and statutory law. But what's interesting is that it's also influenced by African and indigenous law traditions.
Exactly. And this blend of influences is reflected in the country's constitutional framework. The Constitution of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, adopted in 1979, enshrines fundamental rights and freedoms, such as freedom of speech, assembly, and the press.
Yes. And it's worth noting that the Constitution also provides for the protection of individual rights, including the right to life, liberty, and security of the person.
That's right. And I'm curious. Leo, How do you think the country's colonial history has shaped its legal system?
Well, Mira, it's fascinating to see how the British legacy has influenced the country's laws, particularly in areas like property rights and contract law. But at the same time, the country has also worked to assert its independence and develop its own unique legal identity.
I see what you mean. And speaking of independence, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a relatively small population, which can make it easier to implement reforms and ensure that individual rights are protected.
That's true, Mira. And it's also worth noting that the country has a strong tradition of community-based decision-making, which can help to promote social justice and equality.
Ah, yes. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that community-based decision-making is an important aspect of a healthy and functioning society.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, Mira, what do you think are some of the key challenges facing the country in terms of protecting individual rights and freedoms?
Well, Leo, one of the challenges is certainly the issue of poverty and economic inequality. When people are struggling to make ends meet, it can be difficult to ensure that their rights are protected.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that the country has made significant progress in recent years in terms of promoting economic development and reducing poverty.
Yes, that's true. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that economic development and poverty reduction are essential for ensuring that individual rights are protected.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, Mira, how you think the country's legal system compares to that of Slovenia, our other country of comparison?
That's a great question. Leo, while both countries have a strong commitment to protecting individual rights and freedoms, Slovenia's legal system is more heavily influenced by European Union law and the principles of human rights.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Slovenia has a more developed system of checks and balances, which can help to prevent abuses of power and ensure that individual rights are protected.
Exactly. And I'm curious, Leo, what do you think are some of the key differences between the two countries' legal systems?
Well, Mira, one of the key differences is certainly the level of judicial independence. In Slovenia, the judiciary is more independent and less influenced by the executive branch.
Yes. And I think it's also worth noting Slovenia has a more developed system of administrative law, which can help to ensure that government agencies are transparent and accountable.
That's right, Mira. And I'm curious, what do you think our listeners can learn from the comparison between these two countries?
Well, Leo, I think one of the key takeaways is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to protecting individual rights and freedoms. Each country has its unique challenges and opportunities, and it's essential to tailor the legal system to the specific needs and circumstances of the country.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have made significant progress in recent years in terms of promoting human rights and the rule of law.
Yes, that's true. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that promoting human rights and the rule of law are essential for ensuring that individual rights are protected.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, Mira, what do you think is the most important lesson that our listeners can take away from this comparison?
That's a great question, Leah. I think the most important lesson is that individual rights and freedoms are not just abstract concepts, but are essential for ensuring that people are treated with dignity and respect.
Exactly. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong commitment to promoting social justice and equality, which is essential for ensuring that individual rights are protected.
Yes, that's true. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that promoting social justice and equality are essential for ensuring that individual rights are protected.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, Mira, what do you think is the next step for both countries in terms of protecting individual rights and freedoms?
Well, Leo, I think one of the key steps is certainly to continue promoting economic development and reducing poverty. When people are struggling to make ends meet, it can be difficult to ensure that their rights are protected.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have made significant progress in recent years in terms of promoting human rights and the rule of law.
Yes, that's true. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that promoting human rights and the rule of law are essential for ensuring that individual rights are protected.
Absolutely. And I'm curious. Mira, what do you think is the most important thing that our listeners can do to support the protection of individual rights and freedoms in these countries?
That's a great question. Leo, I think the most important thing is to stay informed and engaged on these issues. By staying informed and advocating for human rights, we can help to ensure that individual rights are protected.
Exactly. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of community-based decision-making, which can help to promote social justice and equality.
Yes, that's true. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that community-based decision-making is an important aspect of a healthy and functioning society.
Absolutely. And I'm curious. Mira, what do you think is the final takeaway from this comparison?
That's a great question, Leo. I think the final takeaway is that individual rights and freedoms are essential for ensuring that people are treated with dignity and respect.
Exactly. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have made significant progress in recent years in terms of promoting human rights and the rule of law.
Yes, that's true. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that promoting human rights and the rule of law are essential. Healthy living and relaxation opportunities in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines and Slovenia. Two countries with incredible natural beauty. But which one takes the cake when it comes to unwinding?
Well, Mira, I think we should start by comparing the spa resorts in both countries. Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has some amazing resorts like the Volcanic Bay Resort, which offers luxurious spa treatments and stunning ocean views.
That sounds incredible. Leo? But what about Slovenia? I've heard that their thermal baths are a must visit. Have you heard anything about the Termodisi Sea, for example?
Yes, the Termodisi Sea is one of the most famous thermal baths in Slovenia. It's a beautiful resort with a range of spa treatments and activities, including a sauna, steam room, and even a fitness center.
Well, that sounds amazing. But I'm curious. Leo, what about the cultural attitudes towards health and wellness in both countries? Do you think one is more relaxed than the other?
That's a great question. Mira, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I think there's a strong emphasis on living a healthy lifestyle. But it's also a very laid-back culture. People tend to prioritize relaxation and enjoyment over strict health regimes.
That makes sense. And what about Slovenia? I've heard that they have a strong tradition of folk medicine and herbal remedies. Is that true?
Yes, that's correct. Slovenia has a rich tradition of folk medicine and herbal remedies, which are still used today in many parts of the country. And I think this has contributed to the country's emphasis on natural and holistic approaches to health and wellness.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that a strong emphasis on folk medicine and herbal remedies is a good or bad thing?
Well, Mira, I think it's a good thing. It shows that Slovenia is committed to preserving its cultural heritage and traditional ways of living.
That's a great point. Leo, and speaking of cultural heritage, I've heard that Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a strong tradition of folk music and dance. Does that play a role in promoting relaxation and wellness?
Yes. The music and dance traditions of St. Vincent and the Grenadines are definitely a big part of the country's culture, and they can be very therapeutic. I've seen people dancing to the rhythm of steel drums and calypso music, and it's infectious.
I can imagine, and I'm sure our listeners can too. So, what about yoga and meditation in both countries? Do you think one has a stronger tradition of these practices?
That's a good question. Mira, I think Slovenia has a strong yoga and meditation scene, especially in the capital city of Ljubljana. There are many yoga studios and meditation centers, and people seem to be very interested in these practices.
That's great to hear. Leo, and what about St. Vincent and the Grenadines? I've heard that they have a strong emphasis on yoga and meditation, especially in the yoga communities on the island.
Yes. The yoga communities on St. Vincent and the Grenadines are very active and welcoming. and they offer a range of yoga classes and workshops. And I think the island's beautiful beaches and natural scenery make it the perfect place to practice yoga and meditation.
I couldn't agree more. Leo, and finally, I have to ask, which country do you think is more relaxing? Saint Vincent and the Grenadines or Slovenia?
Well, Mira, I think it's a tie. Both countries have their own unique charm and relaxing qualities. But if I had to choose, I'd say Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is a bit more laid back and relaxing.
I see what you mean, Leo. But I still think Slovenia has a lot to offer when it comes to relaxation and wellness. And I'm sure our listeners will agree with me on this.
Well, let's hear from our listeners. Then, what do you think about Saint Vincent and the Grenadines and Slovenia as destinations for relaxation and wellness?
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more content like this. Saint Vincent and the Grenadines offers a beautiful blend of faith and culture, with a strong emphasis on community and spirituality. The island nation is home to many different faiths, including Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, and visitors can experience the unique traditions and customs of each.
That's fascinating. I've always been drawn to the idea of a spiritual melting pot, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines seems like the perfect place to experience it. I'm curious, Mira, have you had a chance to explore the island's many places of worship?
Yes. I've had the chance to visit some of the most beautiful churches and temples on the island, and I was struck by the sense of peace and tranquility that permeates each one, from the stunning stained glass windows of the St. George's Cathedral to the intricate carvings of the Hindu temple in Kingstown. Every place of worship is a testament to the island's rich spiritual heritage.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I can almost picture the vibrant colors and intricate details of the temples. And I'm sure the sense of community is palpable, especially during festivals and celebrations.
Exactly. The island's people are incredibly welcoming and proud of their cultural heritage. I've had the chance to participate in some of the island's many festivals, including the Sugar Musk Carnival, and it's amazing to see the community come together to celebrate their faith and culture.
I'm sure it's a real treat to experience the island's vibrant culture firsthand. And I'm curious, Mira, how does the island's spiritual landscape compare to that of Slovenia?
Slovenia is a beautiful country with a rich spiritual heritage of its own. While it's primarily Catholic, there's a strong tradition of Eastern Orthodoxy and a growing number of Muslims. And the country is also home to a number of beautiful churches and cathedrals.
That's interesting. I've always been fascinated by the contrast between Eastern and Western Europe, and Slovenia seems like a perfect example of this. I'm sure the country's history and culture have played a big role in shaping its spiritual landscape.
Exactly. Slovenia's history is marked by a complex mix of influences, from the ancient Illyrians to the Roman Empire and the medieval kingdoms of the Middle Ages. And this has resulted in a unique blend of Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and other faiths that's reflected in the country's beautiful churches and cathedrals.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And I'm sure the country's spiritual landscape is also reflected in its many festivals and celebrations. Have you had a chance to experience any of these? Mira?
Yes. I've had the chance to experience some of Slovenia's many festivals, including the Ljubljana Festival, which celebrates the country's rich cultural and spiritual heritage. And I was struck by the sense of community and connection that permeates each event.
That sounds amazing. I'm sure it's a real treat to experience the island's vibrant culture firsthand. And I'm curious, Mira, how do the two countries compare when it comes to freedom of religion?
That's a great question. Both Saint Vincent and the Grenadines and Slovenia have a strong tradition of freedom of religion, and visitors can experience this firsthand by attending services at various places of worship. I think Slovenia may have a slightly more complex relationship with freedom of religion, given its history and cultural context.
That's a great point, Mira. And I'm sure the country's complex history has played a big role in shaping its spiritual landscape. I'm curious, have you had a chance to explore the many museums and cultural institutions that showcase Slovenia's rich spiritual heritage?
Yes. I've had the chance to visit some of Slovenia's many museums and cultural institutions, including the National Museum of Slovenia and the Museum of Modern Art. And I was struck by the sense of depth and richness that permeates each one.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I'm sure it's a real treat to experience the country's vibrant culture firsthand. And I'm curious, Mira, how do the two countries compare when it comes to community support for spiritual growth?
That's a great question. Both Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia have a strong tradition of community support for spiritual growth. And visitors can experience this firsthand by attending services at various places of worship or participating in community events. However, I think Slovenia may have a slightly more formalized approach to community support, given its history and cultural context.
That's a great point, Mira. And I'm sure the country's complex history has played a big role in shaping its spiritual landscape. I'm curious, have you had a chance to explore the many beautiful churches and cathedrals that Slovenia has to offer?
Yes. I've had the chance to visit some of Slovenia's many beautiful churches and cathedrals, including the stunning Ljubljana Cathedral and the beautiful Maribor Cathedral. And I was struck by the sense of peace and tranquility each one.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I'm sure it's a real treat to experience the country's vibrant culture firsthand. And I'm curious, Mira, how do the two countries compare when it comes to spiritual growth and development?
That's a great question. Both Saint Vincent and Slovenia have a strong tradition of spiritual growth and development, and visitors can experience this firsthand by attending services at various places of worship or participating in community events. However, I think Slovenia may have a slightly more formalized approach to spiritual growth, given its history and cultural context.
That's a great point, Mira. And I'm sure the country's complex history has played a big role in shaping its spiritual landscape. I'm curious, have you had a chance to explore the many beautiful parks and gardens that Slovenia has to offer?
Yes. I've had the chance to visit some of Slovenia's many beautiful parks and gardens, including the stunning Ljubljana Botanical Garden and the beautiful Maribor Park. And I was struck by the sense of peace and tranquility that permeates each one.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I'm sure it's a real treat to experience the country's vibrant culture firsthand. And I'm curious, Mira, how do the two countries compare when it comes to spiritual tourism?
That's a great question. Both Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in Slovenia have a strong tradition of spiritual tourism, and visitors can experience this firsthand by attending services at various places of worship or participating in community events. I think Slovenia may have a slightly more formalized approach to spiritual tourism, given its history and cultural context.
That's a great point, Mira. And I'm sure the country's complex history has played a big role in shaping its spiritual landscape. I'm curious, have you had a chance to explore the many beautiful monasteries and convents?
I'm telling you, Leo, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is all about embracing diversity. From the moment you step foot on the island, you are surrounded by the vibrant culture of the indigenous people, the African slaves, and the European colonizers. It's like a delicious stew, where all the ingredients come together to create something truly unique.
But what about Slovenia? I'm sure they have their own secrets to share when it comes to social equality and respect for minorities. After all, they're part of the EU, and they've made significant strides in promoting diversity and inclusivity.
That's true, Leo. Slovenia has come a long way in terms of recognizing and protecting the rights of minority groups. But I think Saint Vincent and the Grenadines takes it to a whole new level. Have you ever heard of the Garifuna people? They're a unique blend of African, Caribbean, and Central American cultures, and they're an integral part of the island's identity.
Actually, I have heard of the Garifuna people. Mira, they're quite fascinating. But I'm curious, what's the significance of their culture in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines?
Well, the Garifuna people have a rich history on the island, and their culture is deeply intertwined with the island's identity. They have their own language, music, and traditions, which are all unique to the island. And let me tell you, their music is infectious. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it.
I'm sure they would. Mira, but what about Slovenia? Don't they have their own unique cultural experiences to share?
Of course, Leo, Slovenia has a rich cultural heritage, and they're proud of their diversity. In fact, they have a number of minority groups, including the Hungarians, the Italians, and the Serbs, and they've made significant efforts to promote their languages and cultures.
That's great to hear. Mira, but I think Saint Vincent and the Grenadines takes it a step further. They have a unique approach to promoting diversity and inclusivity, which is all about embracing the melting pot culture of the island.
Exactly. Leo! And it's not just about the culture. It's also about the people. The islanders are known for their warmth and hospitality, and they welcome people from all over the world with open arms. I'm sure our listeners would agree that this is a key factor in creating a harmonious and inclusive society.
I agree. Mira, and I think Slovenia could learn a thing or two from Saint Vincent and the Grenadines when it comes to promoting diversity and inclusivity. But what about the challenges they face? Don't they have their own set of problems to overcome?
Yes. Leo, every country has its own set of challenges, and Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is no exception. But what's remarkable is how they've addressed these challenges head-on, and have come out stronger as a result. And I think that's something that our listeners can learn from.
I agree. Mira, and I think it's time for our listeners to weigh in on this topic. What do you think about the approach to promoting diversity and inclusivity in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines? Do you think it's something that other countries could learn from?
Well, I think it's safe to say that our listeners are a clever bunch, and I'm sure they'll have some insightful comments to share on this topic. So, let's hear from them.
Indeed. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners will have some fascinating perspectives to share. Well, that's all for now. Folks, thanks for tuning into our podcast, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
And don't forget to follow us on social media, where we'll be sharing more content on this topic and many others. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever thought about retiring in a beautiful island nation surrounded by turquoise waters and coral reefs?
Actually, I have. Mira. And one of the countries that comes to mind is Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. It's a hidden gem in the Caribbean, isn't it?
Exactly. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants in this lovely country.
That's right. Mira, so let's dive in. Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a relatively simple tax system, with a flat income tax rate of 15% and a 10% tax on capital gains.
Wow, that sounds quite reasonable. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners are wondering about the pension plans available to long-term immigrants.
Yes. Well, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines offers a national pension scheme, which provides a guaranteed minimum pension of 10% of the employee's salary, with an additional 10% from the employer.
That's great to know. Leo, and what about social safety nets? Are there any available to support long-term immigrants?
Yes, Mira. The government of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has implemented various social programs, including a national insurance scheme, which provides benefits for old age, disability, and unemployment.
I'm sure our listeners appreciate knowing about these programs. Leo, now, let's compare Saint Vincent and the Grenadines to another country. Slovenia, which has a more complex tax system.
Yes. Slovenia has a progressive tax system, with rates ranging from 19% to 50% of taxable income, and a 9.5% value-added tax.
Well, that's quite different from Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. And what about pension plans in Slovenia?
Well, Mira, Slovenia has a mandatory pension system, with contributions from both employees and employers, and a guaranteed minimum pension of 15% of the employee's salary.
That's interesting. Leo, and how do the social safety nets in Slovenia compare to those in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines?
Well, Slovenia has a more comprehensive social security system, with benefits for old age, disability, unemployment, and even sickness and maternity.
I'm sure our listeners are impressed by the social safety nets in Slovenia. Leo. No. Let's talk about the residency requirements for long-term immigrants in both countries.
Ah, yes. Well, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines requires a minimum stay of 183 days per year for tax residency, while Slovenia requires a minimum stay of 183 days in a 12-month period for tax residency.
That's a great point, Leo. And what about the language requirements for long-term immigrants in both countries?
Well, Mira, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has no language requirements for long-term immigrants, while Slovenia requires proficiency in the Slovenian language for certain jobs and professions.
I see. Leo. And what about the healthcare systems in both countries? Are they available to long-term immigrants?
Yes. Well, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a relatively limited healthcare system, while Slovenia has a more comprehensive healthcare system, with universal coverage and access to quality medical care.
Well, that's a big difference. Leo, I'm sure our listeners are interested in knowing more about the cost of living in both countries.
Yes. Well, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a relatively high cost of living, especially in the capital city of Kingstown, while Slovenia has a lower cost of living, especially outside of the capital city of Ljubljana.
That's great information. And what about the cultural and social aspects of living in both countries?
Yes. Well, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a rich cultural heritage, with a mix of African, European, and indigenous influences, while Slovenia has a more developed tourist infrastructure and a vibrant cultural scene.
I see. Leo, and what about the education system in both countries? Are there any opportunities for long-term immigrants to access education?
Yes. Well, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a relatively limited education system, while Slovenia has a more comprehensive education system, with access to universities and vocational training.
That's great to know. Leo, and what about the overall quality of life in both countries?
Yes. Well, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a relatively high quality of life, with a relaxed pace of life and a strong sense of community, while Slovenia has a more developed infrastructure and a higher standard of living.
I'm sure our listeners are impressed by the comparison. Leo, and finally, let's talk about the residency by investment programs available in both countries.
Yes. Well, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines has a citizenship by investment program, which offers citizenship in exchange for a minimum investment of $400. While Slovenia has a residency by investment program, which offers residency in exchange for a minimum investment of $400,000.
That's a great point. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners are interested in knowing more about the benefits of these programs.
Yes. Well, both programs offer a range of benefits, including tax-free status, access to quality healthcare, and the opportunity to live and work in the country.
Wow, that's a lot to consider. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners are grateful for the information we've shared today.
Yes. Well, we hope our listeners have found this comparison helpful, and we welcome any feedback or questions they may have.
All right, guys. Let's dive into 31. The rate of meeting specific interests for Saint Vincent and the Grenadines and Slovenia. I'm to explore how these countries nurture diverse passions and hobbies.
That's a fantastic topic. Mira, both countries have a unique blend of cultures that make them perfect for enthusiasts of all sorts. I'm curious, have you ever been to a beach festival in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines?
Actually, I have. Leo, it was an incredible experience. The energy of the crowd, the music, and the delicious food. It was a true celebration of the island's culture. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that Slovenia's capital, Ljubljana, is a hidden gem for music lovers.
Oh, Ljubljana is indeed a treasure trove of music and art. But let's talk about Saint Vincent and the Grenadines' love for sailing. The island's crystal clear waters and stunning beaches make it a sailor's paradise. I'm sure many of our listeners would love to try their hand at sailing there.
Sailing is an excellent example of how Saint Vincent and the Grenadines meet specific interests. But did you know that Slovenia has a thriving community of cyclists? The country's scenic roads and bike-friendly infrastructure make it an ideal destination for cycling enthusiasts.
That's right. Mira, Slovenia's cycling community is indeed impressive. And speaking of cycling, have you heard about the annual Tour de France event that takes place in Slovenia? It's a world-class cycling competition that attracts top athletes from around the globe.
Well, I didn't know that. Leah, it sounds like an incredible experience. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that St. Vincent and the Grenadines has its own unique events and festivals. For instance, the island's annual carnival celebration is a vibrant display of music, dance, and costumes.
Carnival is indeed a highlight of the island's cultural calendar. And let's not forget about Slovenia's love for food and drink. The country's traditional dishes, such as goulash and patisserie, are a testament to its rich culinary heritage.
Food is a great topic. Leo, both countries have a unique cuisine that reflects their cultural diversity, but I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about Slovenia's wine country. The country's vineyards and wine cellars are a must-visit for any wine enthusiast.
That's right. Mira, Slovenia's wine country is indeed a treasure trove of fine wines and beautiful scenery. And speaking of wine, have you tried the famous Saint Vincent and the Grenadines rum? It's a delicious spirit that's perfect for sipping on a warm island evening.
Rum is a great choice. Leo, but I'm sure our listeners would agree that St. Vincent and the Grenadines has its own unique spirit, the island's friendly and welcoming locals.
That's so true. Mira, the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines are indeed some of the friendliest and most welcoming in the Caribbean. And let's not forget about Slovenia's love for festivals and events. The country's annual Festival of Lights is a spectacular display of light and sound that attracts visitors from around the world.
That sounds like an incredible event. Leo, but I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about St. Vincent and the Grenadines' love for sports. The island's annual cricket tournament is a thrilling display of athleticism and skill.
Cricket is indeed a popular sport in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And speaking of sports, have you heard about Slovenia's love for winter sports? The country's mountains and ski resorts make it an ideal destination for skiing and snowboarding enthusiasts.
Winter sports are a great example of how Slovenia meets specific interests. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that St. Vincent and the Grenadines has its own unique winter experience. The island's mild climate makes it an ideal destination for winter sun seekers.
That's so true. Mira, St. Vincent and the Grenadines is indeed a great destination for anyone looking for a warm winter getaway. And let's not forget about Slovenia's love for nature and the outdoors. The country's stunning mountains, forests, and lakes make it a paradise for hikers and nature enthusiasts.
Nature and the outdoors are a great topic. Leo, those countries have a unique relationship with the environment. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about Slovenia's love for sustainable tourism. The country's commitment to eco-friendly practices and responsible tourism is truly inspiring.
That's so true. Mira, Slovenia's commitment to sustainable tourism is indeed admirable. And speaking of sustainable tourism, have you heard about St. Vincent and the Grenadines' efforts to protect its marine ecosystem? The island's coral reefs and marine life are a vital part of its ecosystem, and the government is taking steps to protect them.
That's a great example of how St. Vincent and the Grenadines meet specific interests. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that Slovenia's love for architecture is a unique aspect of the country's culture. The country's stunning buildings and historic landmarks are a testament to its rich history and cultural heritage.
Architecture is indeed a fascinating topic. Mira, both countries have a unique approach to architecture that reflects their cultural diversity. And speaking of architecture, have you heard about Saint Vincent and the Grenadines' love for traditional buildings? The island's historic buildings and colonial-era architecture are a testament to its rich cultural heritage.
Ah, traditional buildings are a great example of how Saint Vincent and the Grenadines meet specific interests. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about Slovenia's love for art and design. The country's vibrant art scene and stunning architecture make it a paradise for art enthusiasts.
Ah, that's so true. Mira, Slovenia's love for art and design is indeed impressive. And let's not forget about St. Vincent and the Grenadines' love for music and dance. The island's vibrant music scene and stunning dance performances are a testament to its rich cultural heritage.
Music and dance are a great topic. Leo, both countries have a unique approach to music and dance that reflects their cultural diversity. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that St. Vincent and the Grenadines has its own unique music style. The island's soca music is a fusion of Caribbean rhythms and African beats.
Ah, soca music is indeed a unique and exciting genre. Mira, and speaking of music, have you heard about Slovenia's love for traditional folk music? The country's traditional folk music and dance are a testament to its rich cultural heritage.
Ah, traditional folk music is a great example of how Slovenia meets specific interests.